And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there already in the Ideas Room. Of course, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, another kind of wild start to a month here as we're getting used to it now. And we've had the Queen's passing, of course. Just before that, we had the new British Prime Minister, Gorbachev, dying. I mean, it seems like if this were astrology, we'd be in serious peril. I don't think there's any question about that. One of the kind of key things as a takeaway, I think, from all the things that are going on is it all started with the weird satanic speech that Biden gave at
the Red Sermon.
The Red Sermon, yeah. I mean, that's a weird way to start things off for the fall. So we knew it was going to get weird.
It's a bad omen. Clearly.
Well, Joe Biden actually comes up tonight because he shares a very strange honor in 1976. And that's going to get pretty interesting just as a kind of background.
You want to do a TKO and just tell everybody right away?
It's coming for sure.
Okay.
But he shares an honor with someone who's just very, very unusual, strange bedfellows, shall we say, all connected around this Inslaw PROMIS UFO file. And what I want to tell you about this, of course, when we get into this very special episode tonight, this is X Series episode 133. It deals with the Danny Casolaro Inslaw mystery, which is a cold case that goes all the way back to 1991. And when we're looking at that, it's quite fascinating because, what we have is a situation where so many trails were presented and then lost through time. And one of the major trails we were able to pick up through a conversation with the cousin of somebody who's a regular on this program, Dr. Joseph Farrell, and his cousin Marty Farrell came on the show, and we did a very interesting episode. It's out there now. That is Casolaro Mystery, and it's all about his two meetings, which were chance encounters in Virginia just before Casolaro passed away, and some of the things that Casolaro was doing. Now, what I found out after going through the testimony of Marty about what he heard from Casolaro, which again were just glimpses of things that Casolaro was working on, is that Casolaro had this habit, especially the more he researched this stuff, of just sharing large amounts of information with people that he would meet and who would, because I think he wanted to talk to people about this and spread some of the knowledge. And he always had this great big file folder with him, which contained all the information around the octopus. He never felt good leaving that anywhere. And that all disappeared, of course, when he was found dead in his West Virginia hotel room. One of the things that strikes me as interesting about all this is that, Casolaro had been at this for a while, and one of the things that's left off in people in their rush to say, well, it was so-and-so controlling the PROMIS software. I've heard everything from the Masons to Israel to the Vatican. It's very tricky. We have to be very careful about that software and who got the backdoor into it. And we may have gotten an opening in this episode that we did with Marty, because it concerned a few things that kept coming up about a programmer named Barry Cumnick and some of the modifications he made to PROMIS to make it into something called Brainstorm, which is very much like how AI operates today. And this may explain a great deal of how we got converted into this kind of bizarro system, as the foundation was laid there in the 1980s. And there were all these court cases over the software. A number of deaths attributed to people who were researching it, including Casolaro, of course, who died in Martinsburg, Virginia, in August of 1991. And the official verdict was suicide. But anyone who knew Casolaro knew that he was warning, I'm not the kind of person who would commit suicide. And by the way, a lot of people are giving me threats. Given the level that he was operating on, you can see a number of people being threatened by his information. But one of his key sources was this genius computer engineer named Michael Riconosciuto. And Riconosciuto hooked him up with a number of sources. And there's a big piece that's been overlooked in this case. I'm not even sure how it got overlooked. And we're going to try to present some of that tonight with you. It's so great to have so many of you here with us. And of course, we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And we'll have a big live back and forth. Miss Olivia is putting those questions together as we speak. How are we doing out there?
Doing great. Everybody's in a wonderful mood and really excited for tonight's show.
I like that. Do you have any questions you want to start with?
I think the first thing is everybody seems to want to clarify exactly what PROMIS is.
Yeah. This is a software that someone who had worked for the NSA through the 60s and 70s and had a big kind of major background in computers and the government. And he was Bill Hamilton. And he and his wife set up this company, Inslaw, and they made this software to track different prosecutions throughout the legal system. And this is something that fulfilled a great need. And originally, there are dealings as far back as the Carter administration with this. But it's really, the whole thing gets into a huge meltdown by the time you get to the Reagan administration and some of the players there. And the scandal around PROMIS is just simply this, that the Justice Department, who had originally got the software from Inslaw and from Hamilton and his wife, decided that they didn't need them anymore, but they continued to use the software. And then through their different partners and things, the Hamiltons realized, oh, the Justice Department just sold this software to Canada and this other country. What's going on here? They're pirating our stuff that we gave them. And so it becomes a huge lawsuit. And then finally, the Justice Department runs Inslaw into the ground with, blocking their charges and all the rest. But it gets to be a very suspicious case, and it attracts a lot of government attention. And by that time, around the mid-'80s to late '80s, we have Elliot Richardson, who was the former attorney general under Nixon, who resigned during Watergate, not for any scandalous reason, but because Nixon had asked him to fire the special prosecutor in that case, Archibald Cox, who was prosecuting Nixon and trying to get tapes and all these other things. So Nixon thought, you know what, I have the ability as president to fire the special prosecutor. I'm just going to do it if it's an egregious thing. And Nixon, they called it, he had a number of firings around that period where people who weren't being loyal. And what happened was they went to Elliot Richardson and he got fired, and then his assistant got fired, and down the line they went. So that's one of those Saturday night massacres that they refer to in the government. And we've seen a few of them. It happens, this kind of strange purge of officials that goes down. And in Nixon's case, he was actually left with Judge Bork. And that's the same Judge Bork who would come up later in the 1980s and try to be a Supreme Court justice, and then they would boot him out. He never got in. But Elliot Richardson was a very high-profile figure, and so for him to quit gave him a lot of cred at that point. So when he comes back in the 80s, and he's the lawyer for the Hamiltons, who are claiming that the Justice Department ripped them off and that there's a lot of criminal things involved with it, then it became a very serious case. And then a House Select Committee looked into it, and it became basically a decades-long scandal. So that's PROMIS in a nutshell, but what really opens it up is the work of Danny Casolaro. And I'm going to get into how Casolaro found out about this in the first place. Maybe a lot of you didn't even know that Casolaro ran tech magazines for a decade. You ever heard that?
I did not know that.
It's very interesting. There's a huge tech background, and that's what gets him involved because he knows about software, and the software story kicks up, and it reignites his investigative journalism passion that he had in the 70s when he covered cases like Watergate and the hostage crisis and all the rest. This is somebody who has a very interesting background, I would say, and someone who showed a lot of passion and a great ability to just get to the bottom of a story. Now, his death obviously got too close on one of these stories, and The Octopus is what that story is called. This is the book that he was planning to put out, and it's pretty interesting because even Time was going to run a series of articles, and this major publisher was going to publish the book. As soon as he died, they were both like, oh no, we weren't going to do anything. He sent us stuff, but we weren't going to do anything. And there were all these witnesses, and we're like, no, he had this whole thing going, contracts and everything else. So everybody had to back off at a certain point. And that's what happens very often in political scandals, of course. But this is a little bit deeper, as I've learned. There is a huge, and I mean major, UFO file aspect to this case that has never been pursued in ufology at all.
And you had no idea about that.
Well, the only thing that I knew in relation to it is that there were notes about Riconosciuto, and I knew about his family and the things that went back with the UFO file. So I knew it on Riconosciuto, but on Casolaro, the extent to which he's involved with the UFO file is off the charts. And I'm going to show that tonight and how it relates to why the PROMIS scandal was so huge, including the presence of Robert Maxwell and his family, including Ghislaine and her sisters. So this takes us into the hot zone. It takes us into the UFO file and into the deep state. So you just, there's nowhere is safe on this one, but it is absolutely compelling. I'm drawn again by the fact that around ufology, in the field of ufology, over and over again, they miss these very important pieces. I've shown it with Douglas Caddy and his revelations about President Kennedy being assassinated over the UFO file. And in the case of Robert Merritt and the Nixon time capsule, the UFO field, it just wants to jump up and down whenever the CIA gets involved and gets them a headline, or Jeremy Corbell and Lou Elizondo, CIA agent, give me an interview, like all this nonsense. So for the last 5 years, the field has been thrown into that end of the pond, and there's a huge UFO threat that's building up around this, which is why looking at PROMIS and what's involved with it, and the fact that there might be an unseen player involved, an unseen actor on the geopolitical stage, as it were, is going to really, I think, take this whole thing to another level. And I do feel that some of the things that Marty put on the record, and like I said, Marty Farrell, when he came on the show, he's very plain spoken about it. He's like, I just had these 2 meetings. It just so happened, when I was in Virginia, I met him, and then we reconnected later. And it's not like he's coming forward with the big, secret about Casolaro. What he is coming forward with is 2 key points. And one I think is particularly interesting, which is that Casolaro himself was confused as to why the Justice Department had freaked out to this level. And I'm hoping I can answer some of that tonight, because I think the case and the research that Casolaro had done is worth it, because it brings us right into the center and to the brink of so much of that invisible control system and the wall of secrecy around so many of these things, which is absolutely crucial. So we will take your questions on the second half of this program. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to remind you, if you haven't already, to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. That's the thing that keeps us in touch. If we're getting some really hardcore censorship, which we've already seen. And, we've seen it with a number of truth-telling channels. But I think in our case, in particular, the way it's worked with us is, they've kind of kept the algorithm down. But we've been reaching out and connecting with so many thousands of you. So we're getting the word out. But the best way for us to stay in touch is to have that direct pipeline through the newsletter. And that's something which you can do by going to darkjournalist.com. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch. It'll also let you know about the incredible, remarkable X series shows, interviews that we have coming up for you, interviews in September and October here in the fall, just that are going to blow your mind, and some very special reports and news items that we'll be watching, documentaries, and of course, events that are coming up. So stand up and be counted. Make sure you sign up for that newsletter. Okay, and with that, Miss Olivia, if you go any further.
Lucy Rain says, "Oh, wow, I'm so glad I made popcorn for this."
You're going to need it.
Everyone is talking about the octopus as a symbol. So the Greenbird says the octopus is a symbol of Spectre, of course.
Yes.
Thomas Tyson, Octopus 8, Octagon. Mind Control Incorporated says, DJ, do we know any of the players in the octopus? And is the octopus the group that put in the first backdoor? Who put in the first backdoor?
Well, what's interesting, officially, it's the Justice Department that puts in the back door and then sells it to other country in order to spy on them. And that includes allies as well, by the way, like Australia, for example, who they sold it to for $500 million. But what we're putting forward, which is new to this, is that through the figure of Barry Kumnick being inserted, who's a real computer programmer who also modified the software and into this brainstorm thing, as I started the show off with. Basically, he was included in a Christian fundamentalist novel, and we're still confirming the name of this novel. Dr. Farrell has read it, but we're just doubling down to make sure absolutely 100% that this is the one. But in that novel, Barry Cumnick is identified as a programmer who, and this is fictionalized. He's a programmer who inserts a backdoor into the PROMIS software back then, before the Justice Department steals it. And what happened as a result of that, of Dr. Farrell mentioning this offhandedly almost a decade ago, is that Bill Hamilton himself got in touch. So what happened with this Marty Farrell realization that we were getting in his conversation when he was recalling the anecdotes about meeting Casolaro is that Marty Farrell said that it seemed to him that Danny Casolaro was very confused as to why the Justice Department was as upset and freaking out to the level that they were in driving this case to the brink. And that suggests, on a research angle, that there was something else that was involved. This is what Casolaro was getting at, which is something else was involved with the software before it hit the Justice Department. Mm-hmm. And the idea is somebody was watching the watchers. And whoever that person is, we're looking at this idea that there may be an unseen actor who's blackmailing people on all sides of this equation. So as much as we've attributed the backdoor action to Israel or Mossad or the CIA or the NSA, whatever that happens to be, certainly the government through the Reagan administration inserted their version of a backdoor, but apparently someone else got to it first, and this is the danger that's involved with this whole case. And so I think bringing that aspect forward is going to give us a whole new discovery line of research on this, and connecting it directly with what I'll show about Riconosciuto and Casolaro in relation to the UFO file, which is just off the charts, and I'm going to get right to it. So I hope that answers it. In terms of the octopus, it's a pretty good description, but I'll tell you this. Did you know that the original title for the book that Casolaro was going to put out was called Behold a Pale Horse? If that sounds familiar, it's kind of interesting, because that's the title that William Cooper used 5 years later to put out his big sweeping piece. So certainly Cooper was aware of the situation with Casolaro. I just think that's really interesting.
Fascinating.
But the final title was The Octopus. And I think it's suitable with the James Bond imagery, because when you think about it, what James Bond and Ian Fleming and the whole bit we're getting at with Spectre is it's a non-state actor. It's not a country, but it often tries to play the countries off against each other, from Russia with Love. But it has access to things like atomic weapons and all these things through his novels. So is he suggesting right there, the octopus? Most definitely. Spectre is kind of a good model in some ways for this when we look at it. No question about it. So let's start off with that UFO file, because that, I think, is going to really cement all this. Before we even get into this story, I want to point out a couple of things about what they're positioning the UFO file with right now. I'd like to start this off with some comments, actually, that were made by Fletcher Prouty. This goes back to 1997. Fletcher Prouty was the intermediary between the Justice Department and, between the Pentagon and the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff back during the Kennedy presidency. And after Kennedy's assassination, he knew something was up, and he even knew that the general that he worked for, Ed Lansdale, had been involved. And so years later, in the 70s, he put out a book called The Secret Team. And he's the person who's portrayed in the JFK movie as Mr. X. So there's your X steganography. Prouty, in the reboot of his book in 1997, opened up with the idea that since the Soviet Union had fallen, that the deep state was basically very, very concerned about who their next enemy was going to be. They had to sort of gin one up because they needed all of the military money and they needed that central control system. And he said, it's obvious to me that UFOs and aliens are being positioned for this, and that they're trying to create a threat, a false threat. Now, we've heard about this false threat before through people like Werner von Braun, who made a prediction about this, and several of his predictions have come true, and that's the Nazi rocket scientist that, of course, we took over here to lead NASA in the Apollo moon missions. So we have it on the record from him through his assistant and the things that he said there. And he was saying, look, they're going to use, a number of things in order to build up this threat thing. They're going to use terrorism. They're going to use, killer asteroids. And then the final card is the UFO alien threat. This is what they're engaged in. And it's very highly dangerous and highly unethical. The level to which they're applying pressure on this and working on it through the government is very distressing. Over the past 4 years, we've outlined the characters very clearly through the TTSA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and their puppets like Lou Elizondo, Jim Semivan, and all these other people. The government people who brought this forward to create this false threat narrative in order to create new UFO Defense Department policies and all the rest. And, let's shoot them down and, you stay in your house. I think one of the things I never get tired of saying is if you thought the COVID op was something, just wait till these guys get to the UFO threat op, because, lockdowns like you've never seen, germ warfare, they're going to be able to say anything about this. Just think of War of the Worlds. But I do have a feeling that we've been cutting through some of their chatter, even with the incredible megaphones that they've been able to play this with. But once in a while, I like to refresh the audience that the things that we've said and put on the record about these people, and then the things that they come out and say themselves, are very, very telling, I think, and get us to a totally different place. I'm going to show you a couple of those. Of course, we've been watching the case of all the CIA people who came out through the To the Stars Academy promoting this UFO threat idea. And one of them, of course, was Lou Elizondo. And Elizondo came forward and said, oh, I'm an ex-Pentagon person. I quit because they won't let out the truth about UFOs, when it turned out he'd been working for the government the whole time, and was an ex-CIA and DIA counterintelligence agent, and was somebody who was just, playing this PR game, trying to be Mr. Disclosure. And he created a program that was called ATIP, which he said that he ran. And later it turned out that ATIP didn't even exist, and that the program was OSAP, and it was only funded $22 million through Harry Reid. And that ATIP was some activity, even according to Lou. And by the way, this person also said they had nothing to do with OSAP. So something strange. But the course of lies over the years, you get so bored with tracking the lies of these people. But the positioning is always what we have to watch. And I think in the case of Lou, the pushing of the UFO threat idea, propping him up on Fox News and CNN and trying to just get that whole thing going, like, oh, we're going to get those aliens, they're out there and they're dangerous. But one of the people who was high-level CIA is Jim Semivan on this. And Semivan is such a deep player on the CIA side. I mean, this is remarkable to have this guy at this level, 25 years, CIA director at top level. And this is a person who we didn't even know existed until 2016 because his work was so clandestine. But they've been running a number of these guys, including John Ramirez, and now also Gary Nolan, who's doing big shout outs to his friend, Dr. Fauci, on Twitter, and the great job that Fauci is doing. And it's too bad he's retiring. Yeah. This is the guy who wants to give us UFO disclosure. Think about that for a minute. And Nolan, again, I've noticed this about a lot of the UFO, CIA UFO threat people, of which Nolan is one, that they come forward and they have a lot of medical credentials, which I find that interesting. For some reason, the CIA went to their medical people to build this up. Even the people who are more kind of, the straight up covert op type people, even they seem to have this background. So that's a little bit disturbing. But anyway, Semivan recently went on a podcast, and he claims to be not only a CIA agent interested in this, but a CIA contactee. And that's the thing that both he, Ramirez, and Nolan all have in common. So now we have these, basically this co-opting of the entire abductee movement as well. Forget not only the UFO threat, but people who are interested in figuring out what happened to them in relation to UFO abduction. Well, now it's the CIA. Oh no, they're the ones who have the experience. Forget about it. And, you know, they're like, oh, I was dragged on a table and, you know, these little beings came to me and all that. So the first thing we have to do, I think, in terms of this information is get the CIA out of it. The CIA is loaded with all kinds of hijinks and purposes for hiding this information. They've hidden it really well for 75 years, and they're not about to give it to you now. So anything that they're pushing forward, just, you know, stay the hell back. One of the things that's bothersome about this is the level of complicity in the media with it. No questioning of these people, their backgrounds and all the rest. Just if they have that credential, that government credential, then they just wave them on in. The other thing I've pointed out is that the media, a lot of the media that's pursuing this does not have a handle on who these people are. They don't have a handle on the subject. They don't understand it. And they don't seem to understand what counter intel is, which is telling lies in order to get your opponent to think something else is going on than what is actually happening. And so in this case, the counter intel object is the American people. And that's what we have to really wrap our heads around. And it's not always easy because, you know, a counterintelligence agent, their job very honorably is to go out there and lie to foreign countries about things that are going on. So we keep a strategic edge in the geopolitical world. But when you lay that ability and, you know, the professional liars out on the American people in order to stage a UFO, false UFO threat, then, you know, for your own profit and control, then we've got a really big problem. So this is the thing I think that we need to pick up on and all be on the same side. Unfortunately, that most of that UFO field has folded because they wanted, I don't know where they got this, because they got the idea that the CIA was going to include them in all this. And so, you know, that their work and their lives wouldn't have been in vain going after this subject. Because finally they could sit down, you know, at the dinner table and say, see, I was right. But one of the things we're going to learn tonight is that the Homeland Security and CIA actually don't even want individual citizens looking at this subject. They're going to call it a defense threat. And so you're not even going to be able to share information about it. This is where they want to go. Okay, so here's the blog. It's from Hermetic Penetrator, and it's called The UFO Program at DARPA. Earlier today, the UAP Studies podcast published their interview with Jem Semivans, former CIA agent, co-founder to the Stars, and of course, former CIA agent. It's no such thing. During the interview, Semivan revealed intriguing new details regarding the experience or study he's a part of, including the fact that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, may be involved. This is important. This is the first time on the record a CIA person has pointed to DARPA as studying UFOs. Now, this becomes very crucial because DARPA's right in the middle of the PROMIS story as well. We're going to go into how that works. Here's the relevant quote. I think, as I explained before, said Semivan on a couple of other podcasts, I've always had a deep interest in the esoteric. You're going to laugh at this one, especially if you're regular X-viewers. Just wait till you hear CIA Semivan give his lowdown for how he got involved. So he says, I got very interested in Western mysticism and then on to Eastern mysticism and the Romanticism, German Romanticism. Actually, at the time, I started studying Emerson, Thoreau, and the mystery schools. So are these guys just playing out the X series? This is what we want to know. Roman mystery schools, Greek mystery schools, Western mystery schools, things along those lines. In about 1992, my wife and I aren't 100% sure. Now he's including his wife in this contactee bit. And I see that going on too, which is, hey, this other relative was there with me. But it's probably around 1991. And then he goes on to recount this incident. And he said, so that's how I got more interested in UAPs, right? We know there's the slang there, UAP instead of UFO. And they're trying to really program that in, you know, when it's this kind of really lame acronym. And the problem is that, again, I've pointed this out with names. It gets very tricky, and it's something which we need to keep an eye on because it puts you in a particular mindset when you say a name. So, for example, if I say the United States, we understand the United States Constitution, beacon of freedom, all these different things, right? That's what the United States stands for. And then, but if I say the homeland, That's a little bit different. Homeland is, something, I guess, I can't even think of a constitution associated with that. So the homeland is what they've been trying to call and rebook as the United States. And they're trying to do UAP instead of UFO. So if you change the name of something, you change what it stands for. And that's what they're hell-bent to do, even if it's a long-term program. So he goes on and on about how he, ran into John Alexander, who's just a wonderful man. Alexander is a very kind of strange operator in the middle of these circles, and he's gotten very into like studying voodoo and things like that. And he's like, for all these years, he was like, oh, there was nothing to that UFO file, and now he's coming around on this. And that's even more disturbing somehow. Didn't you like it better when they were just like, oh, we don't know anything about it? Well, so he's like, oh, he came down to our house and interviewed me and my wife. We went to a DARPA lab, and the experience and the videotape, we took it all to a DARPA lab. And then a couple of weeks later, that's when all sort of hell break loose. Jacques Vallée came out of my house and spent the day with us. Wonderful man. And then people came over to our house. And then he goes on and on. I happen to have kept them all not too long after I had briefings on a classified level by people that you would know as CIA. Yeah, well, it's not too surprising because you're a 25-year CIA veteran. But the interesting thing here is that he's saying that DARPA is studying his contact case in UFO, which is a UFO contactee case. So now DARPA, who's making your favorite killer robots, and it's just this kind of out of control research lab, which is totally kept under wraps by the U.S. government. Here they are, investigating UFO and the UFO subject. So now we have Homeland Security, DARPA, and the CIA ganging up on this thing to create a threat that doesn't exist, and to use all kinds of different ways and means in order to promote this thing, because after all, they've had access to the classified data for 25 years. Now, instead of sharing these things that they've collected over that period of time, they've created a weird narrative. And they're still testing that narrative out on the public. And so it's very important in terms of the CIA position. And this includes the Department of Homeland Security getting involved with this as well. That government charade around UFOs, it has to be something that we have a higher awareness level on, a situational awareness of just how dangerous it is, because it's connected with the activating of emergency powers, and that gets into continuity of government, martial law, suspending the Constitution, and all the wonderful things that they tried on a lighter basis during the COVID crisis. Like I said, this would be much more hardcore. So then at the end of this blog, which did a pretty good job on that, it says Jim Semivan's remarks obviously open up a whole new area and open up a whole new set of questions, such as, is there a formal UFO programmer experience or study at DARPA? If so, how? What, if any, relationship is this between the program OSAP, ATIP, or the UAP task force, which is still going on today? Is it still going on today? This is important, and that's the article I was reading from, the characters involved. And I think if we're getting into territory where DARPA is taking the lead with the CIA and Homeland Security on the UFO thing, that it's just a kind of a crisis in the research around the thing, and that the people on the UFO side need to start telling the press that they're not playing along with the CIA narrative on this. And it's very important for us not to get played on it. But what's interesting is a lot of people don't know anything about the UFO subject. So they're going to run into this and they're going to think, oh, the CIA is finally coming out with UFO disclosure. And there are a number of articles actually in Vice, of all things, really kind of pumping this up like, hey, this is great. Like the CIA is admitting there's UFOs, woo woo, like there are aliens. Not realizing just how dangerous those types of agencies are and why they would be coming forward, considering what they're good at is hiding things and keeping secrets. So when they want to, tell you something is real, then what it really means is going on is that they have a totally different agenda than transparency, and that you can take to the bank. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight on the PROMIS software UFO connection. How is it connected to the UFO file? I'm going to show you. Some of these updates are there about what these agencies are doing now with the UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of the show. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Walter Bosley is in the ideas room tonight, and he just wanted to add, counterintelligence is more than that. Countering with false intelligence is a tactic, but counterintelligence means countering intelligence activities of hostile targets. The context is important.
Yeah, but the hostile target, I would have to correct you a little bit, Mr. Bosley, even though I'm a big fan. The target in this case is the American people. So that's the trick with this one. And that's the thing that we need to point out, that it is this corridor or aspect of counterintelligence that they're using, which is the lying part. So, you know, I might give very simple explanations of what the counterintelligence is, just to give us kind of a handle on what it is. I mean, you, having been in counterintelligence, can absolutely tell fascinating stories about this. But we also have to get real. I think that the people involved in this that we've seen operate over the last 4 years are counterintelligence people who are professional liars. And so with that asset, with that experience, we have to remember
expertise.
That's the one. But we're going to, you know, when we talk next, we're going to drill down on this, because I want to hear all of your impressions about what's been going on with what we're saying about this, and also what we're seeing. I mean, when you see someone on the level of Elizondo, for example, who's been caught in public dancing left and right, and a number of us have pointed out, then I think, you know, we have to say that they're using that counterintelligence information, knowledge, and they're using it to create a narrative. And in this case, the narrative is to throw us off the track of the real thing. And I think this is where we find kind of areas of agreement on that. But I think it's good to kind of see exactly how they're operating on this. And they've built it over 4 years. I mean, the field, the way that I've pointed it out, since 2017 now, December, it'll be 5 years of this. And it's really sucked all the oxygen out of the field. There's no way to even get the real conversation going. You know, here we have the conversation on a level where I think we can discover things. In the field, it's gone so crazy around the TTSA part and the counterintelligence people that are ruling the roost, mostly CIA, by the way, predominantly, with now a mix of Homeland Security. So we have to kind of start to identify this in an obvious manner, so that even the most basic person coming into the field can understand there's UFO disclosure and there's CIA UFO disclosure. And what we're seeing full on in the media is CIA UFO disclosure. Not even to mention the marketing creeps that get involved in this thing. What else you got?
MTL Momzilla added, they are countering our intelligence.
Exactly. And that's really the way to think about it. And your intuition, too. Because remember, the subject itself has nothing to do with any intelligence agency. It has to do with people and their own intergenerational experiences in some cases. And when I think of so many people who've had UFO experiences and gone deep on this subject, and we've seen, like, look, Casolaro, he was killed for digging into the information that he was. That was 30 years ago. And a big piece that I'm going to show that was missing in coming forward about his story is his research into the UFO file. So people have been living and dying and sharing stories on this for decades. This is a human story. It has nothing to do with, you know, Jim Semivan or some CIA person. Absolutely nothing. Those people are paid operators, and they want to come in and they want to spin, and they want to do intel spin because there's a perception management campaign that's involved. And we have to take it a little bit differently than if this was happening, say, a decade ago, because of the types of actions that the government has taken against their citizens all around the world in the past 3 years. So it's looking at it on a different level. And the UFO threat thing, you know, I remember when there were guys like who are respectable guys in the field generally, you know, they had an incredible track record. Think of guys like Knapp and Dolan and Pope has been around for a long time, all these different people. And they were all saying, look, you know, they're not promoting any threat. You know, it's not like the CIA is coming in and promoting a threat to the media. The media is not doing that. And the TTSA isn't part of that, but they are. They were. And these people just wanted to play along that wasn't happening. So now what? Well, whether it's those people or whoever, they let their audience down. And because they had the knowledge and the base to protect their audience from that type of information. And they should have said, this person who just sat down in front of me is a 25-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. So he could be here spreading disinformation. I just have to open with that. That would have been number one. And of course,
that would have been a beautiful opening.
The other thing is, on this program, I've invited all those people from TTSA, and they'd be afraid to come on a program like this. Not because they'd be afraid of me, but the fact that I would just penetrate to the core of the question, which is all that time, with Lou stuff, do you still work for the government? Well, the answer was yes, because he works for Space Force. So this idea when they say ex-Pentagon, it's not true. Space Force is right under DOD. That's all Pentagon. So he never left. And so the idea was they had done their market research and figured out they needed a character who could come out and say, I'm against that government, because I'm a whistleblower and all the rest. But if it's not true, then we have a problem, right? That means that the person's lying publicly, one, and two, that the media is allowing the lie. So now people who are trying to work with this narrative have figured it out. And you see everyone from the New York Post to the Black Vault and all these other people being like, Elizondo, forget it. Like this whole thing, all these different players, and not just Elizondo, a number of different people involved in the CIA op, but it came out of TTSA, and TTSA was the front for it. And that's how you do it. CIA comes out and they put a company $50 million in debt. They know how to get some traction. You spread that kind of money around the UFO field, it's pretty dramatic. But that's all a PR show.
Did they ever have to account for where that money went?
No, because it's a private company, and the company front is it's an aspect. I want us to look at it just to know that this is how they operate. But I can point out to you CIA front companies who've done the same thing decade in and decade out. This is just something the CIA does. And that one now is around, and they're like, hey, we're going to make comic books and TV shows. It's like, I thought you were going to make lighter than air intergalactic vehicles, and you were going to reveal the UFO file. What's this all about? And so the people who promoted those companies, I guess my question is, for the Knaps and the Dolans of the world, what now? You promoted these guys. They turned out to be saying falsehoods in public, and they've wasted 5 years of the public's time. And there were a lot of people saying that they were CIA people doing this. And now what? So do those people finally say, yeah, we were taken for a ride and we need real research. And from now on, we're going to say if there are CIA people coming into this, then that's a red, that's just a red flag. And we're not going to accept this government UFO threat activity. Or are they going to keep playing along and trying to be along for the government ride? And everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep here on the UFO file. And now we're getting into the promise piece. We're going to take your questions in part two. It's great to have so many of you here with us, and some great familiar faces out there in the audience tonight. Miss Olivia, before we jump in.
I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
William Ledger says, did Elizondo work for pre-Space Force Trump, like initial Space Force, or Biden's Space Force? Do we know?
No, he basically, Elizondo has so many government jobs that it would be a labyrinth to chase him through. Someone just found him working at a nuclear agency. So, you're going to find a labyrinth with certain types of players like that. But we know that according to his own testimony, he was special assistant to James Clapper. And Clapper was the DNI who got caught lying before Congress. And then in the role there where he was operating this program, as Elizondo said he did, the CIA director that he'd be answering to was John Brennan. So these are the people that he would be involved with on that tip. Elizondo changes his story a lot, so we really don't, it's hard to say. And a lot of the people who were trying to play ball with him just got sick of it. But the people, and I think even the people who are promoting the op are kind of sick of the Elizondo part, because he has so much opposition involved. But now they're trying to promote this other thing, which is Gary Nolan, and he's a CIA scientist who is also an experiencer, just like Semivan is. And we need to talk about this. I mean, when CIA people say that they're contactees out of nowhere, you know, what are the odds that you're going to have 3 of the major contactee people coming forward right now, and they're all CIA? I mean, you know, it's an op. Let's get real. And these people have been engaged in the op. The TTSA op didn't come off. And what they're trying to do is salvage aspects of that to really push the UFO threat part over. But remember, the United States Congress position now is that UFO threats are exponential. They're increasing exponentially. So it's their rhetoric. It's not us saying, oh, you know, we think that they're doing this. This is what they're telling us. And one of the major headlines that came out was Navy says all UFO videos classified, releasing them will harm national security. This is interesting because this is going to stretch out too, because the next thing is going to be, oh, you know what? You took some really good footage of a UFO with your phone. Well, they're a national security threat. You're going to have to surrender that to Homeland Security. Sorry. And I pointed out, of course, that in the hearings that they had in May, you know, they had a DOD official, and they had Representative LaHood from Illinois, and he said, isn't there some way that we can punish these people who are like, you know, have the gall, baby, these amateur interest groups for looking into UFOs? And
Punish.
And then, you know, his counterpart there from the DOD was like, yeah, you know, Ronald Moultrie, he said, yeah, you know, I'm going to talk with you about that, Congressman. We'll get together on that and figure out, you know, well, there has to be some kind of penalty. So, you know, here we go. Penalties for researching UFOs. That's where they're going. The Navy says it has more UFO videos, but doesn't want to share them. Oh, shoot. But we've been hearing that when these guys, and we had like Tim Burchett was one of the congressmen, and I've got to ask this question, like, where are all these congressmen and senators who are suddenly so in love with the UFO subject? Where the heck did they come from? You know, I've pointed them out. Marco Rubio, he loves the UFO file all of a sudden. You know, oh, we have to have a UAP threat. You know, Senator Gillibrand, Democrat from New York, Rubio, Republican Congressman Burchett said, well, I was in this meeting and this guy took out his phone and he showed me a classified UFO. You know, they're not going to show that stuff on a phone. So, you know, there's some kind of charade going on here, and there's a money train behind it. And these guys are all interested in the money train that goes with it. Unfortunately, behind it is, you know, the big snarling face of these agencies like Homeland Security and the CIA driving it. Something is driving that threat piece, just like they used to drive the Cold War threat paranoia. And just like, you know, in that case, von Braun predicted that they were going to go through these various threat stages, and the alien threat was going to be the final card with it. Well, whether you believe in the prediction or not, this is how it's playing out. So we need to take a look through the lens of history to find out where we are, I think, in the middle of all this. All right, everyone. So that gets us rolling to go into, we have to take our minds back now to a place which is Virginia in 1991. And there is journalist out there has collected a lot of information about what the government is doing. But one thing that hasn't come to light so much about Casolaro and his research is that he was looking very deeply into the UFO file, and that the person who connected him with most of his sources, namely the computer engineer genius, Michael Riconosciuto, who has a very interesting background and is welcome on this show anytime. But he said that Casolaro was killed over an exchange about the UFO file. Have we ever heard that before?
When did he say that?
He did. In fact, right after Casolaro was killed, he put this on the record. I'm going to read his quote, as a matter of fact. But it gets us into this territory, which is all about Casolaro looking deeply into Area 51. And this was before Area 51 was the hot topic that it became through the revelations of Bob Lazar with our friend George Knapp. And, you know, whatever we think about Lazar, and of course, there's a lot of reasons to question everything that he's come forward with. dramatically instead of accepting it blindly. But it put that whole story on the record, which I think is a crucial move, regardless how we see it. And there's something about that case, which is a mix of information, because certainly something on the real side came out about it. Now let's look a little bit at some of these quotes regarding Area 51. We have to go back to Jim Keith's research, who is another journalist, unfortunately an author, who was doing amazing research around this area and had an untimely death. Some people think his death was suspicious as well, including his partner, writing research partner, Ken Thomas, who did a good job carrying on the legacy of his work and put out his own steam shovel press work. But some of the things that were happening in relationship to this were being reported in different articles that both Jim Keith and Ken Thomas were doing. So I'm going to read just a little bit about this. And so this says, one theory has it that Casolaro's death had less to do with the Octopus than it did with manufacturing fraud at Hughes Aircraft. Yeah, that's Howard Hughes Aircraft. And, you know, we've done documentaries and a number of things relating to Hughes Aircraft and the kind of wall of secrecy and connection around President Nixon and all sorts of political assassination shenanigans in relation to that. And also the fact that Hughes had a big role in the early redevelopment program around UFOs. Casolaro had brushed up against this corruption. So Hughes Aircraft has a long history of exclusive and secret deals with the U.S. government for aerospace technologies, many almost certainly involving Area 51. So this is what got Casolaro interested. But then a number of his notes contained full sections relating to MJ-12, Majestic 12, small group controlling the UFO file. This is not ordinarily associated with Casolaro's research at all. So we kind of have a tiger by the tail here with opening this up, and I'm going to show you how. Now, interestingly enough, Wackenhut became very important as a player around the PROMIS software role, because it's mentioned by Riconosciuto as one of the places where they were doing this backdoor insertion in the software. And they were also using Indian reservation land in order to test advanced laser weapons. Now, Riconosciuto himself has a very legitimate background in this sense, which is that, you know, he went to Stanford. He was chosen as a young prodigy. He was a genius programmer. And one of the things he did as a teenager was develop a argon laser. Now,
who does that?
It is an unusual life. And, you know, he has that kind of unusual appearance as well. It's just a very interesting character in the middle of all this. But I'll tell you, almost as interesting as his dad, because his dad runs this ad agency, is very involved in politics in Washington State. But who becomes his partner in advertising but Fred Crisman? And Crisman is someone who is so deeply involved around the UFO file and political assassination that his presence as the father of Riconosciuto puts a different spin on this case immediately, right off the bat. I actually, I find weird pieces of this, because we're also talking, when we talk about Crisman, about Kenneth Arnold and some of the original reporting around what Arnold saw. That's where we get flying saucer and the whole UFO thing. Well, interestingly enough, if you go into Arnold's background, he had a lot to say about Crisman, because when he interviewed him, he thought, this is really strange, you know, because he's telling us about this famous Maury Island case, which is the case that happened before Roswell, and it's June of 1947. And right off the coast there, this guy who's on a lumber boat, you know, where they recover logs and things like that, he sees these weird donut-shaped craft which give off this slag, and supposedly the slag comes down and kills his dog and burns his child's arm and damages his boat. The person who was his partner in all this was Crisman, and Crisman and this Harold Dahl go and they're interviewed by Kenneth Arnold, who gets hired to go and research their story. And a number of weird things happen with Kenneth Arnold. And the Maury Island story becomes the first Men in Black story, where these peculiar figures show up and basically say, keep quiet about this. So we're in strange territory immediately with this. So it's almost like the birth of the UFO era includes all of the things. It's got the flying saucer part. It's got the Men in Black. It's got the strange disappearances. It's got hoaxes, all around that one case. And but some things we can put on the record about it is that the two Air Force security officers who came to interview Harold Dahl and Fred Crisman and take some of that slag back with them went down in a plane crash with that supposed UFO debris. And this is right after Arnold met them in this hotel and interviewed Crisman. And then Crisman takes off for Alaska. So not to say he had anything to do with the crash, but his presence in the middle of all this is quite peculiar. This is a shot of Arnold meeting with President Eisenhower. This isn't a picture you see every day. Here's the person who basically created the flying saucer meme by having his own sightings over Mount Rainier, and he's shaking hands with, yes, at the time, the President of the United States. So
who then?
who had his own kind of interesting UFO connections. Here are some shots of Crisman, and let's get a couple of things on record about Crisman because it's quite fascinating. Crisman was an OSS officer during World War II, then became part of the CIA when it was created by the National Security Act, which, by the way, the anniversary of that's coming up next week. That's 75 years of CIA heaven. One of the things we're looking at with Crisman is he's involved with the birth of the UFO phenomena with the Maury Island case. Not to say that there weren't earlier cases, but the one case that's known to really kind of shake things up is Kenneth Arnold's case and then the Roswell case. Well, this one was just before it, maybe like a week before Arnold's sighting. Now, interestingly enough, Crisman, he gets into this whole UFO piece, and he becomes later somebody who runs these conferences around UFOs. And then he's somebody who claims that he's under all of this kind of political pressure and that people are shooting in his car. And when he writes an autobiography under the name of John Gold, called Murder in the City, it is in there. He talks all about his relationship with Marshall Riconosciuto, who was Michael Riconosciuto's dad. And he talks all about how they discover surveillance equipment and a bug there in Marshall Riconosciuto's office. And that the person who discovers it is Marshall Riconosciuto's son, Michael, who calls him uncle. Okay, so that's how close this relationship is. So Michael Riconosciuto calls Fred Crisman uncle.
Okay.
And his uncle has him doing all these little jobs for him, and he becomes like his mentor. And from the age of 12 years old, he's been recognized as a genius. Stanford has taken him in and all the rest. But now he's good at surveillance. So there's a lot of intrigue instantly right off the bat with that piece. Then it turns out that Marshall Riconosciuto, who's also kind of a genius, and his son start this company called Hercules. And there are a number of things that come out of that, including the fact that they mine, they're a mining company, and they do these kind of unusual pieces. And then Riconosciuto gets involved supposedly with weapons manufacturing. And these different types of explosives. So he's an unusual character. And one of the things he gets charged for later in life is operating an underwater psychedelic drug development laboratory. That's before Promise software. That's before all the rest of it. And he gets sent to jail for creating an underwater acid laboratory, basically. One of the things that he claims when you listen to his own stories, and I find them very interesting, is that during the kind of hippie era. He's one of those guys that these FBI and people set up to create these different types of psychedelic events and all the rest, because they want to surveil the crowd and figure out how people react to this. So his background goes all the way back. So he's got this kind of UFO hangover from his father's work with Crisman. And then he also has this psychedelic 60s period where he's very young and somehow gets involved with manufacturing psychedelics. And then he does various jobs for the FBI as well. So his background is absolutely just speckled with all kinds of interesting things. But Crisman's background doesn't end with his unusual stories about Maury Island. And also before this, he also claims he was writing letters to a science journal before the Maury Island case, saying that he had encountered these people from ancient Lemuria in a cave and had basically like a shootout with them, you know, when he was during World War II, when he went over to the East. I mean, really far out stuff. And but showing a great level of knowing the steganography around ancient civilizations, being involved in the first flying saucer case. What else could you be involved in that would just make you a total legend? What else would you be involved with that would make that? How about the JFK assassination? Do you think that would do it? UFOs, Lemuria, and the JFK assassination. Who thought that Crisman was a Boeing defense contractor assassin and was involved in the JFK assassination and put him on trial for it, or put him for questioning during the trial? Jim Garrison. So Jim Garrison gets information about Crisman that the first person that gets called by Clay Shaw, who is Garrison's chief suspect in the JFK assassination, is Crisman. And that when they trace their calls after the fact, he makes 18 different phone calls to Crisman. So Crisman meant a lot to Clay Shaw somehow. So by the time Garrison is questioning Crisman, and he does come to New Orleans and take part in that trial, when he interviews him, he asks him, what were you doing down here? You know, why were you spending all this time in New Orleans? You know, isn't your home in Washington? What's going on there? And what is it that Crisman tells him? He says, I was down here to meet Mr. Roswell.
What?
So when you read that transcript, I'm sure maybe, you know, there was a Mr. Roswell, but it reads kind of weird.
Well, it sounds like code.
It does. It does. When you know that somebody is being pressed in relation to this. And we have to remember Garrison knows a great deal, and he's running into a lot around the UFO file in relation to the JFK case. And it's very puzzling to him when he goes after the past relations of Lee Harvey Oswald and people of this nature. And he goes to Riley Coffee House and he says, you know, you were working here. You know, Riley is like this huge kind of coffee conglomerate in New Orleans, and they're known to be hardcore right wing. And he said, you know, he's interviewing all these employees, and he's like, well, what happened to this guy who worked for Oswald? Can I talk to him? And they were like, no, where is he? So, he went to work for NASA. And time after time, all of the different people who were supposed to be working with Oswald went either to NASA or to Lockheed. So that really stops Garrison in his tracks. And then he finds out from the manager that Oswald had been saying to his friends that when he left the job there, that he was going to work for NASA. So we have a huge aerospace signature going on with this. But then you'll find out when we get into the Casolaro case, even a little bit deeper, there's a huge aerospace piece that has to do, again, with Lockheed, Hughes Aircraft. And so this is the piece. I think what we have to remember here is we're in a deep state situation, but we're also in a deep space situation. And, you know, so often I've tried to use the term secret space program to get us into that, but, you know, it's been so tainted by the likes of Gaia TV and other people that I think deep space and deep space operations is a much better way to describe it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Going deep tonight. We just started on the Crisman part and the Casolaro connection, Riconosciuto. How does this all play out with the UFO file and PROMIS software? It's there and it's deep. We're getting into it tonight. I want to remind you, if you haven't already, please go to darkjournalist.com. Sign up for our newsletter. That keeps us in touch, regardless of the intense scrutiny and, just heavy duty censorship that we see in relation to this. And of course, we're not the only ones, but a better way to guarantee that, I'll use every platform that's out there as long as I can. But the better way to guarantee contact is to make sure you're on that newsletter. It's a free newsletter, and we'll just let you know about the incredible things we have coming up. We're going to be taking your questions soon. How are we doing out there?
Caritas Tarot says, is it possible that this Crisman person is a, quote, legend or identity repository for all these experiences, useful for hiding CIA agents' identities?
Well, that's really true that they operate like that. Oswald was very much like that. Remember that there's a memo from J. Edgar Hoover in 1960. That's 3 years before the assassination, from the top guy at the FBI, saying that someone's using Oswald's identity and, his paperwork, and they're here, and Oswald's in the Soviet Union. So what's going on here? So he's asking questions about him before that. By the time you get to the assassination, everyone's like, oh, he's a disgruntled clerk who worked for $1.25 an hour and beat his wife. It's the most ridiculous throwdown of this guy. They had stationed Oswald in Atsugi in Japan, which is the highest security CIA position in the development of the U-2 that you can get. You don't put a guy in there who's a communist. And that brings us to the Guy Bannister section. I've talked a lot about Bannister in the past, but he plays into this whole promise thing. So let's just give him a little bit of oxygen. Guy Bannister is a friend of Garrison. They're both in the FBI early on. Guy Bannister is the guy that they send out to Washington and Oregon and other places to track down saucer crashes. He is the guy who develops the Security Matter X designation. He's the innovator, the creator of the X files. He knows all about X steganography, and he's applied it directly to the UFO issue. Bannister becomes CIA chief in Chicago, and then comes down to New Orleans out of the blue and starts a private eye agency and hires Lee Harvey Oswald. And he hires him to infiltrate student groups and to pretend he's pro-communist and pro-Castro and handing out leaflets and things like that. Bannister himself runs a very hardcore right-wing operation. And Jim Garrison called him to the right of Attila the Hun. So the idea that Oswald would be a leftist working for him is completely a joke. But again, you have a big UFO signature around Oswald with the fact that Bannister is his boss. And that's the summer before the assassination. Then what happened was, after the assassination, Bannister dies, and supposedly it's a heart attack, and then all of his files disappear. But his wife keeps a list of his files and eventually sells it to a local library. And we find some really weird things on there, including the fact that a lot of his projects are all about these advanced space projects, and they have to do with aerospace companies. So we're looking at an interesting figure there who was a key person around the assassination. Garrison said he was the most important figure that he had come across in terms of the assassination investigation. And he knew him. He knew him from his FBI days. So let's put our heads around this for a minute. Guy Bannister's involved with the UFO file. Fred Crisman's involved with the UFO file. And Garrison understands Crisman's role, through various clandestine agencies, and actually thinks that he's the guy who's involved in the Kennedy assassination. So there's some deep operation there that's trying to be penetrated on the Garrison side. And they elude, they keep eluding justice on this because they are able to utilize their different UFO, the covers that they have for the Central Intelligence Agency, and also they're different, in the case of someone named Eugene Braden, who Garrison was convinced was involved in this. Ronald Reagan was the governor in California and said, oh, I have this guy in my prison, but you can't have him. You can't put him on trial. He's in my prison. Just forget about it. So he denied him extradition rights. So there was something going on there. And you're going to find Reagan shows up again And very often with Reagan, it's not so much, I think that Reagan is sort of the mastermind behind these things. I think that Reagan comes in with a very right-wing crew, and those people are hell-bent to get their agenda done through the figure of Reagan, and they're taking advantage of his own idealism and his wanting to get America back to what it was. I think this is what we're seeing more of there. I would also say with Reagan that he had his own deep interest in the UFO file, and that's seen throughout his career, and that one of the things he wanted to do was unite. You know, he wondered to Gorbachev in private if there was a UFO invasion, if they would get together and fight them off. You know, would we work together to do this? Which is a really weird question that Gorbachev put on the record and said Reagan was absolutely dead serious. So whatever they were telling Reagan, I think that they were suggesting to him, they were kind of using the UFO threat thing on him the way they're doing it on us right now. So we have to kind of look at Reagan in a couple of different ways. But we're going to go back to Riconosciuto here, because I want to get something out about Riconosciuto, which is he's absolutely off the charts comments regarding the UFO file. And it's going to, when we get through some of this, it's going to really blow your mind. Here's the article about him being put in jail over manufacturing psychedelics. And that article is from 1972. And it says, drug manufacturer receives sentence. U.S. District Court Judge Walter McGovern has sentenced Michael James Riconosciuto, 25, up to 2 years in prison for manufacturing illegal hallucinatory drugs. In making the ruling, McGovern recommended Friday that Riconosciuto be sent to a federal prison in Springfield, Missouri, where mental treatment is available. Riconosciuto was convicted of operating an underwater laboratory in the Duwamish River here, where he manufactured the psychedelics. The fact
underwater laboratory?
Underwater, yeah. This is kind of the peculiar thing about Riconosciuto's presence.
I don't understand that.
Obviously, he basically set up some kind of almost like submarine apparatus in order to do this.
We're going to have to scratch the surface there and get into that more.
It is. I would agree with you.
I mean, I've watched other documentaries about hippies that made psychedelics in the 60s and stuff. None of them were underwater.
None were underwater. I believe that.
Somebody says Aqualab. It's great.
So, I mean, also the fact that he's operating around psychedelics again. I mean, this is also kind of an interesting thing, but let's leave that for a moment. Let's go into what he says about the UFO file. Get ready. Are you ready? After Casolaro's death, Michael Riconosciuto made claims that Casolaro had learned nothing more than what one of two intelligence factions wanted him to know in order to embarrass the other faction. One faction was called Aquarius. This is Riconosciuto, and had a leadership subgroup called MJ-12. The name, of course, of the supposed secret group founded by Harry Truman in the wake of the Roswell flying saucer crash. Riconosciuto even told one writer that he had witnessed the autopsy of an alien body. Okay, remember, this is Jim Keith going deep on this. Let's go through that again. Riconosciuto even told one writer that he had witnessed the autopsy of an alien body. Now look, the alien autopsy thing didn't hit till 1995. That's when there was the big Fox push and all that, and the madness that they put into that. And then it turned out that the guy was hoaxer and all the rest. But the story of an alien autopsy is a different piece. And now we're looking at somebody who says that he witnessed this. Okay, this is the same person who's giving the PROMIS software inside intel to Casolaro. So think about this. Yeah, what do you got?
No, just I'm listening to you. It's incredible.
No, I agree. I think the fact that we have this piece with PROMIS and its association with the UFO files off the charts. Let's keep going, shall we? All right. Some have suggested that the tales of extraterrestrials that surround areas like Area 51 and Pine Gap serve as disinformation to deflect attention away from serious issues such as gun running and black project weapons development. Casolaro's own view and the extent of his knowledge and interest in this tributary from the Octopus research and whatever he learned from what might have brought forward the truth closer to the surface from the murky waters in which he swam may have died with him. So that Casolaro was getting close to this. But here's the interesting thing, which I started with, which is that Casolaro himself was studying MJ12 and Area 51 in this whole piece. So by the time he encounters Riconosciuto, he knows about these things. And this is before the Bob Lazar realization. So he's tracking something right hardcore and right in the middle. And I think that he gets it through his study of Hughes aircraft, because that's deeply involved with the UFO file. There's an interesting thing here in something that was left behind. I went through a number of records of Casolaro's that are on the record still, and they were things that were found in his apartment because his hotel room had been ransacked and all of his research had been taken from his car in his hotel room. But they didn't get everything from his place. One of the things they left behind, I don't know if anyone has put this on the record. I can only think that they must have, but I haven't been able to find it. This is the first time I've heard of this. But this is in those records, and it's clearly notes about Robert Maxwell. And I'm going to put this up and then tell you what it is. So just take a quick look at it. So it's Casolaro's own notes, and he is talking about meeting there with Robert Maxwell, whose phone number is listed there, and Ian Maxwell, who's Robert Maxwell's son and Ghislaine's brother. And so what we have is some notes that say the European, Robert Maxwell, and the address is the Maxwell House up there in London. Ian Maxwell is clearly outlined there. So he's in contact with the Maxwells, trying to get information about them, trying to get something about what's happening there. But there's two names underneath the cross there in the middle, and one of them is Summa, and the other one's Wackenhut. Now, Wackenhut, as I pointed out, is the security service and the security firm for Area 51. And they were also known as basically like a real black projects weapons company. What happened is that Summa is the group that's in the heart of the Howard Hughes empire, and it's a group of Mormons. And the idea is that Summa group actually creates Summerlin, which is an intentional community that they've grown right outside of Las Vegas. But Howard Hughes bought that property and all those acres and never did anything with it. Finally, after the supposed death of Howard Hughes, he probably passed away a long time before that. But interestingly enough, here we have right in the middle of all this, the Summa Corporation, basically the Mormon wing of the Howard Hughes organization, listed on the same page with Robert Maxwell in his own notes. I don't know if I've never seen that combination before, and I think that this is an explosive combination of detail, and then Wackenhut right underneath it. So we find ourselves in the middle here of the UFO file on one hand and the Howard Hughes Corporation on the other, right in the center of Casolaro's research, which is predominantly meant when people raise the Casolaro issue, they're like, oh, he knew a lot about Iran-Contra and BCCI. He was involved in all these scandals of the 80s. But you don't hear the UFO file mentioned in relation to it. However, he's so deep into it that Riconosciuto, upon Casolaro's death, says, well, he actually got caught in between an intel war of these people trying to feed him information. And one side was Aquarius, and they were associated with MJ12. That's his main source right there, Riconosciuto, telling you that the Casolaro information is coming directly from a UFO intelligence outfit. So I think these things lead us to believe that the 30 years of the cold case action in relation to our friend Danny Casolaro has to do with two major things. One is the thing that Dr. Farrell brought forward on the show with his cousin Marty, which is, did somebody else come in there and put a backdoor in this software, which became so worldwide and explosive in terms of information systems? And that harvesting of information changed the game, and it changed the governments around the world. But did somebody get there first? And is that somebody a kind of invisible player, an unseen force in the geopolitical world stage? this becomes a crucial question for us to answer. Then the next question is, well, if this is where the octopus was going, the UFO file was right in the middle of it. That's where he was looking. And his chief source said, oh, he got caught basically in a shooting war between these two UFO intelligence outfits. So it puts a number of the things that we're looking at now, like the continuity of government emergencies, like the UFO threat push, like the various emergency power seizing throughout the globe in the last 2 years by these governments, in a totally different place. It suggests that some group is operating with global governments around a particular plan, and it seems somehow that it's getting them all on board with it. And how do you do that unless you have something with which you can blackmail the whole world? That's the question, and it has everything to do with the unseen player and with the UFO file. That's what we're looking into here, and Casolaro's work's right in the middle of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, a deep dive off the diving board here for you, going deep on Danny Casolaro and Michael Riconosciuto and the PROMIS scandal, including the Hamiltons, who brought the software forward through Inslaw. And remember, Hamilton had that incredible long track record of government work and NSA work before all this. So you have the government deeply involved with this, even before the scandal starts. And probably somebody like Hamilton could really see the handwriting on the wall because he knew how the government operated. And once he saw them taking that info and all the rest and selling his software to different countries through pirated means, he knew something was up. And that's where the case comes from. And that's why you see other very high level establishment players like Elliot Richardson getting involved. They know something's up and they want to be right at the heart of it. I want to remind you before we go any further, if you haven't already, sign up for our newsletter at darkjournalist.com. That's a free newsletter, but I want you to be on there because we've been seeing a lot of different types of censorship. And that's basically a newsletter you're going to get once a week, letting you know we have some great shows coming up. And, you know, we have part 1 out of Farrell and his cousin Marty and that whole story. We also have in the member section a longer discussion with Farrell and Marty, and that's fascinating. I advise you to get over there and check it out. All right, the next phase that we're going to look at is how does this all intersect on the UFO side with a little bit of that history. So we're going to get a little bit on the Crisman, Arnold, Eisenhower side. We're going to do that. Before we do, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
It's interesting. The porn bots just showed up. Right on cue. So did you have a chance to research Wackenhut at all, where they're located, their history?
Oh, I know a great deal about Wackenhut. But the thing is, for the purposes of this conversation, like the Wackenhut piece weaves in and out in relation to what Casolaro put on the record, I probably will do something about Wackenhut and its relationship to moving the UFO file piece in relation to weapons of, you know, warfare activities. But that's probably a different show. But yeah, okay. Very interesting indeed. What else you got?
David Tormina, DJ, does Riconosciuto have direct connections with Maxwell or Epstein?
Well, he studied the fact that Maxwell had got involved very early on with the PROMIS software. And I have a whole section on Maxwell coming up right here. So you're going to be, that'll probably answer it better than a quick answer here. But I will say Maxwell and his family are deeply involved in moving that software around. There's a story, even good researchers get locked into this. And the story is that Maxwell put a backdoor in for Israel, and Israel's controlling the world with all this. We got to be careful. What happens is, you know, some people think China's controlling the whole world. Some people think Israel's controlling the whole world. Some people think the city of London's controlling the whole world. Some people think the Fed is controlling the whole world. We have to look at the margins with which people do things, and that somebody has one piece of the pie and somebody has another piece of the pie, and that I think one of the things we get in work like Catherine Austin Fitts or Dr. Joseph Farrell is you're going to see that it's not monolithic, in fact, and that those are factions that face off against each other. So it's very tricky when we see that happen. However, there's indeed a point where you can say for sure Epstein and Maxwell worked for Mossad. There's no question about it. But in relation to PROMIS, it's worldwide. It's not just in relation to one or two countries. So that becomes, I think, important. Before we jump to Maxwell, I'm going to read this. This is a original FBI report. They're doing surveillance on Jim Garrison, who's getting into some of these questions. And Jim Garrison now has information relating to Fred Crisman and how Crisman's a part of this case. And here are some of the notes from their surveillance. So they say, out on the coast is a man you should talk with. And what they're doing is they're spying on communications that Garrison got. This is one of the letters he got. Out on the coast is a man you should talk with. Trace this information out. His name is Fred Lee Crisman in Tacoma, Washington. He flies to New Orleans steadily. For the New York's, in 1964, 11 times into New Orleans. In 1965, 17 times. 66, 32 times. 67, 24 times. He's the first man that Clay Shaw called after being told that he was in trouble, and he's the first man that Beckham called also. He was questioned by both the CIA and the FBI in 1966, but he's unable, he's been able to call Washington, and they laid off of him in a hurry. He's very good friends with the Cubans, and especially S.A., not sure who that is, in Dallas. He goes there too, and J.R. in New Orleans. Mr. Crisman is a very old man, very odd man, sorry. He supplied the money for certain political campaigns in return for, he's very much protected by politicians. Now, this whole background goes on in a series of letters that Garrison has with this back and forth, but the person involved knows a great deal about intelligence and knows a great deal about Crisman. And then the FBI is spying on the calls, which is why we still have a record of it. So he goes into how Crisman is a pilot. So this got me thinking about pilots and how I came across a weird piece that has to do with how a pilot who was an experimental test pilot got involved in the PROMIS case as a major figure in making it happen, and was one of the first people to, through his company, approach the Hamiltons to try to buy the PROMIS software and head off any difficulties that the government may have by the fact that they were selling this with a backdoor to all these other countries. And the company is called Hadron Incorporated, which is one hell of a name.
Wow.
And this character and his background in approaching the Hamiltons, I think, comes into play here. Because, again, we have a lot of people who have that military background. A lot of them are pilots. And my guess is a lot of them are in on that UFO pilot activity secret, which is what is the, that's the bond that they share. So let's get into some of that now. Of course, a couple of quick pictures here. That's Elliot Richardson, who, as I pointed out earlier, is the person who was the Attorney General under Nixon, quit when Nixon gave him the order to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. And he became the lawyer for Inslaw in this whole case. And he really pressed the case that he knew Casolaro had been murdered.
How did that resolve?
Well, originally, there was a judge in the federal court who said, you know what? This is very clearly in favor of Inslaw. And he gave them, he awarded them all this money for it. But what happened was there was an appeal. That judge got thrown out and they didn't reappoint him. And then there was an appeal and they got a new judge in there. And that judge said, no way, there's no problem with the Justice Department. And then they had a House Intel Committee, which was supposed to go for a special prosecutor and all the rest. But they looked at it and they said, oh, there's nothing wrong with the Justice Department. They didn't do anything wrong either. So it was basically a whitewash. And what they needed to do was clean that whole thing up, because between Iran-Contra and all the different things that had happened, there was that piece that was already tanking political figures left and right. But we know that there was something else deeper there, because at the time they were showing Reagan Star Wars and SDI and all this stuff as a reaction to a UFO threat. This was the idea. We're going to show Reagan these films that we have of these ships that are refueling by Saturn, and we're going to scare the heck out of the old man and make him do something and get this actor out there to talk about aliens. But what was interesting is I think that there's been an aspect of that national security state which has looked at these things that are going on and seen craft that they're not able to identify and have figured out and plotted out how they can spin that to their advantage. Now, I think they know so much more about the UFO phenomena than we do. And I also think that a good deal of the phenomena is coming from them and their own experiments around this. So, we're talking about the UFO file, we're getting both. One of the things I like to point out in terms of the X technology is that this whole piece about the X technology resides inside the UFO file. So the UFO file then not only extends to the idea that there's an off-world civilization visiting here, but something like the Tesla technology or these things that have had precedence, say, in the mystery schools, some of the Keeley technology, things of this nature that have been rediscovered. That goes directly into that UFO file. It's all in there. And apparently the secrecy around it is something which, and I've said I've made up this word because it's kind of in history, but it's kind of not. But the word is called apotheum, and the effect, the name I've given the effect. The effect is basically a kind of canceling out from the way I read things. It is a reality distortion field that takes place that upsets the physics that we understand. And that's the kind of effect, the apotheum effect inside the UFO file, why they have the wall of secrecy around it for so many years. Part of it is they are studying it, but two, they don't know how to control what this effect is. I've pointed out the effect. I talked with a number of UFO researchers about it. You can always get the details about it. When does the actual UFO phenomena upset reality? Well, when somebody passes through a wall when they're abducted, that's a little bit different than, walking into a craft, right? So this is how to understand what apotheum is. This is the thing that I think that they are up against in the national security state. So it's something I think they've already exploited as well. But, I think on this program, when I've talked to Dr. Joseph Farrell about certain types of physics, and, when we've talked about torsion physics, and I'm going to sort of, it's kind of a quote, but it's not quite a quote, but he says something to the effect that it is basically, it makes an atomic bomb look like a firecracker. So, that idea is definitely a paraphrase, but it gets to the point, which is whatever this thing is, that apotheum effect is what they become so nervous about. So when you get things where people lose time, and when you get things where people are abducted through walls, and when you have a craft land and nothing ever grows there again, these are all in that kind of checklist around things. By the way, you don't really hear about that in relation to the whole CIA wave, because they want to save, they have a weird thing cooked up, that they've been having these UFO people come forward and talk about consciousness. And lately, I've noticed that the CIA people, including Semi Van and Ramirez, and this is spreading now to people like Corbell, a filmmaker, and all that, which is they're saying UFOs are just at the tip of the iceberg. Wait till you see what we've found out about consciousness, and it's going to be CIA come to Jesus moment. I'm telling you, this is where they're going. So the idea is for the kind of control that they want, the kind of control they need through this, it has to be almost like a religious experience. So they think they can get that through the threat thing. They're trying for that. But there's a secondary program, which is, like open your heart to the CIA. And they'll give you this consciousness shift that the UFOs are just the tip of the iceberg of, So now I see them shifting and trying to kind of put even more on top of that, because I think that they realize there are limits to the threat piece, and that they need a backup plan as well, because the threat, they're doubling and tripling down on the threat now, but I think they want this other thing. And that's where you get Nolan and that whole piece. And, I pointed out with Nolan, aside from the fact that he's waving thumbs up to Dr. Fauci and all this stuff, but Nolan gets on these programs like Tucker Carlson and things like that. And Tucker Carlson and people like this, we just need like a letter writing campaign to get these people on board, because they just don't understand that they're under a CIA operation. That's a threat operation, rolling these people out. And that if they want to get to the heart of the UFO matter, if they want to do serious research on it and call themselves edgy and all that stuff, then, then Megyn Kelly can't sit there and interview like Gary Nolan and Lou Elizondo and think that that's the real thing. Those are just government people. And those government people come out and say, that government needs to give us the truth, and they are the government. I mean, you work for the government, right? Well, good. Then you're the government. So, those people are involved in this, but they realize it sounds good because, when people are going from outside and saying, I'm a whistleblower, I need to come in there and get that information, and I'm here trying to get the public on my side, and we're going to get that truth from the government. But if you work for the CIA, then it all rings hollow because you're answerable to your superiors. It's very simple, so those people need to come in with that attitude, and they can get maybe real UFO stories from people on the ground, ordinary people who are witnesses about it. Much better way to go, in my opinion. Miss Olivia, go for it.
God's Truth War says Dennis Montgomery recently gave Mike Lindell co-ownership rights on his software involved with Hammer and Scorecard. He placed backdoors in his software after the government stopped paying him to use his software, Prism ? And this sure sounds like the same situation with PROMIS.
Well, I kind of extrapolated it out in a way that Facebook is kind of PROMIS as well, because PROMIS mutated into a profiling software and a predictive programming software. So the idea was, I know everything about this person. I can predict everything that they're going to do from birth to death, basically. And if you have that predictive ability, then you have the ability to really, this is what Palantir was after, right? And the work that they did for Facebook. So we're looking at groups that are looking for that. In my opinion, that is the holy grail for them, to predict how things are going to go, because that gives them the ability to predict stock markets, geopolitical events, what people will do in relation to restrictions and all the rest. There are wild cards involved in these things. So any kind of measure to control reality through software predictions, might turn out in the end not to be such a reliable science. But this is the holy grail, in my opinion, for them. So there are a lot of different softwares, and there's a lot of different games around those softwares. I think, we've interviewed documentary filmmakers about manipulation of war propaganda and how that's built into the software. And I've done discussions before with people about entrainment software, which is a software, when you're looking at your phone, you feel like, oh, I'm compelled, I have to just stay in there, and you see people walking around in a complete hypnotic trance. And you just, you're looking at that big truck that's just coming around the corner, and you're like, I just hope that they look up before that thing gets them. So this is the kind of stuff that we're watching. So we're in the middle of that soup of things all the time. So therefore, I would say, that's interesting. I mean, there are things about Scorecard and certainly the software that's involved with Dominion and all that. And there's so much manipulation going on around this. I think it's a worldwide scandal. And so I think that, the awareness around the roots of it, and PROMIS software, in my opinion, it becomes the foundational piece of everything that they've built off this system in terms of getting data mining. And that's exactly where I think the foundation of it is. And so when we get a look at the players who were involved in setting it up, and then looking how the world changed after the fact, I mean, it's not like you can blame one particular aspect, but that aspect of this thing taking over governments and exploiting and blackmailing using information, it's kind of like imagining the FBI at its worst, when it was blackmailing with control files through J. Edgar Hoover, and then turning that into a worldwide electronic surveillance machine. Well, what are we looking at now? It's control from space. And what are they utilizing for that? Well, they're weaponizing space. They have satellites and, all these different things. Now everything's run through space. There's an early stage of PROMIS where there are some whistleblowers around it. And one of those whistleblowers, I was just reading his piece. It's Ari Ben-Menashe, and he was saying that one of the key things that they were programming PROMIS for was to go through things like water commission software and to go through things like utilities and credit card companies. So you think of the flow of those different types of information sources and what they could be used for and exploited for, and it starts to boggle the mind. Now, people will go, wow, the financial transactions, arms trafficking, and all the rest. But you never hear in relation to this part, how does that affect the UFO file piece? Because if you have the ability in a backdoor software to go into the government's computers, what do you get? You get whatever they have on the record for the UFO file, right? I mean, yeah, you get the Kennedy assassination records, you get other things. But this is what I think there was such a fear reaction. Have you ever seen a fear reaction like what they did with Julian Assange, for example? I mean, it was off the charts, and they had assassination programs in the open to try to get this guy. And now they have him in prison and they want to extradite him here. So when you look at WikiLeaks, what was it that they were doing? They were kind of doing the same thing in reverse, which they were releasing things and these people couldn't catch up in time to figure out how to counter attack. And so in the case of 2016 with the election, when WikiLeaks is releasing the emails that are showing Hillary Clinton is corrupt, what takes place? Well, the election gets swung to Trump because there's enough public awareness that she's so corrupt that they don't want her. But a lot of that's WikiLeaks. Let's get it on the record. I mean, he was releasing her emails every week. That was very damaging. And he was putting on the record the shenanigans that she was pulling. So that's their worst nightmare, if you think about it. So now apply that to the UFO file. What if WikiLeaks had taken the information in the UFO file and released that weekly? What kind of situation would we be looking at then? These are the types of questions I think we get into when we go deeper on this. Okay. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Space Ghost says, it always goes back to aerospace. Najat Madri says, what are the chances the secret backdoor PROMIS serves something off planet? And Mind Control Incorporated says, DJ, could PROMIS be used to communicate with ET?
Oh. Am I going to say yes to all the above? I certainly think that, look, control is very interesting when you think about it. And one of the goals of the Nazis in being so hell-bent around this rocket program was to control the things on the ground as a grid from space. And the idea was, from space, we'll control things on the ground. So the idea that a lot of these software players that we're seeing and a lot of these people that are involved, that it's related to space is, in my opinion, 100% on the ball. I think the whole thing gets down to space, because space is how they control things on the Earth. But here's the second part. Is there a space player involved? And is this thing in relation to, working with an off-world civilization? That's less clear, but certainly the game is about space. My own personal opinion is that we have off-world civilizations. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I don't think that all the things that get identified as off-worlders, like the Greys, are visiting aliens. I think there's something else going on there. And I refer you to the work of Gigi Young on that, because I think over and over again, she comes back to it and raises the question about, there's a lot of inconsistent things about the Greys if they're an alien species visiting here. It seems more like an abandoned timeline type of situation, which runs a little deep on the cosmological side. But there's something else operative in relation to space. I think that is exactly where you're 100% right. So I'm going to mention, I want to go back to this pilot thing. Do you remember I mentioned the fact that Crisman was a pilot? Well, there was a test pilot involved in the heart of the Promise case. And I believe he was a UFO test pilot. They call him an experimental Navy test pilot. But in fact, his work became medical, and he became a medic in Vietnam and things. But he got involved while doing that in the Phoenix program, which is an assassination program that we conducted in Vietnam to get very high profile enemy figures. This is the figure involved at the heart of the Promise scandal. And he's Earl Bryan, and Riconosciuto mentioned him directly to Casolaro as the person who caused this whole thing to happen, where they put in backdoors into Promise and then put pressure on Inslaw to give them that software. And the thing was, when they contacted them to buy them out, they said, you know, we want to buy you out, and we want you to become a part of Hadron Inc. And the Hamilton said, we have no interest in doing that. And then they said, we have ways of making you do this.
Did they say it like that?
Exactly. That's the quote. So this is Earl Bryan. There's his picture, which is found on a funeral site as a test pilot. And this was posted by someone who knew him and said, I bet you didn't know that our friend Earl Bryan was a test pilot in the Navy. And I was like, isn't that interesting? Because there were so many things that weren't adding up about this guy. And I'll just run through them real quickly in a stream of consciousness kind of fashion. One, he had tried to marry way above his station to this debutante from New England. And he constantly tried to impress her with money. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. Then he married her. She divorces him. And then he goes back trying to get more money to get her again. That was interesting. Then next, he's a medical guy, and he's in charge of the California Health Department under Governor Reagan. And while he's there, all these files about these welfare cases disappear. 75,000 files of individuals disappear, their health records. And then the state presses him, where did all those cases go? And he hangs out and he doesn't answer. And for 3 years, they're after him for these files. Finally, they turn up in a university. The question is, what was he doing with the files? The next thing is, although he's listed as being head of the Department of Public Health in California, there's a subset of his duties there. And one of them involves mind conditioning experimentation. So this guy was on a weird track right off the bat, and there's a big money signature. And then he becomes the director of Hadron Inc. And then Hadron Inc., Earl Bryan, he, as part of the Reagan administration, he becomes, when Reagan becomes president, he gets a position with Reagan. So this is somebody who was in the heart of these matters, and he's not talked about enough because I think we're looking at somebody who's the UFO crossover. Riconosciuto says quite a lot about this guy, including the fact that he was the one who was in charge, along with the incoming CIA director, of the idea of not releasing the Iranian hostages till Reagan became president, because that would swing the election to Carter. That's the so-called October surprise, where Bush and the incoming CIA director, Bill Casey, went to France and met with Iranian officials to try to get them not to release those. So here's a few things that I found were interesting. And are you ready for the TKO?
Let's hear it.
This is the Man of the Year piece. All right. He prided himself on innovative, cost-effective legislation, particularly in healthcare. During his tenure, he helped move California from a ranking of 48 out of 50 states in healthcare costs to second out of 50. His innovation, a lot of that was throwing people who were in mental institutions on the street, but hey, let's not count that. His innovation included a modest co-payment from patients, the first ever implemented in the country. Oh yeah, so he made you pay for your healthcare. In 1975, he was awarded one of the top outstanding men of America, along with co-recipient Joe Biden. So he's awarded with this prize of one of the top outstanding men of America, along with co-recipient Joe Biden in 1975.
Wow.
Biden has just, as he came in as one of the youngest senators at 29, in a very corrupt Delaware political scene. And he gets in there, and there are actual Nixon tapes where he's talking about, like, where did this guy come from? Like, who are his handlers and all that about Biden? This guy, before he gets to Promise and all the hijinks that he does there, he's voted top outstanding men of America along with Joe Biden. Just unbelievable. Okay.
You must have been shocked when that came up.
The serendipity of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was astonishing. Let's say it that way. 1975, he was awarded. Okay. In 76, he left Reagan's cabinet, and he continued his involvement on national health care issues. Although he briefly entertained a career in politics, and they don't mention the whole thing about him going after this debutante. After an unsuccessful bid for U.S. Senate in 78, he moved on to pursue a business career. He becomes an incredibly seedy venture capitalist, and he's funding, he's doing slush fund things and funding one of his companies by using the $50 million investment of this other company and all these weird swaps so he can get in the heart of this. There's a special that I watched, what went back to the Promise era, and they were talking about his mansion, and they showed this thing in Washington, and it was incredible. I mean, this guy had really amassed a lot of money. He moved with his family to New York City and began several business ventures, including Infotech, UPI, Hadron Inc., and Financial News Network. He fondly remembered his colleagues and kept up with many of them through the years. Financial news updates. He's the guy who came up with the little ticker that came across the bottom of the screen. And what's interesting is he did very well in the stock market, and you wonder about the predictive nature of some of the things that he was looking into. Okay. His work as a venture capitalist began in 1982. Now, what's interesting is when he's going after this debutante and he's moving these slush funds around and trying to amass all this money, he gets caught. This is after, I'm going to fast forward after the Promise scandal. And when he gets caught, they realize the amount of financial trickery that he's been involved with, and he ends up going to prison for 4 years. So the main player who was trying to force the Hamiltons on this issue was Earl Bryan, and he was doing it through this company, Hadron. Hadron was directly trying to acquire the Inslaw software. This guy had the Navy test pilot background. That was first, and then he becomes this strange Phoenix assassination program CIA player. Then he's a medic, and he runs Reagan's California Health Institute, and all these records disappear, and he's listed as doing this kind of mind control experiment. Now, those things are on the record about him. Then he shows up in the early 80s involved in this Promise program. So he's a player, obviously, that when we speak about the entire issue, that Riconosciuto said, oh, that's the guy who was behind the entire thing, and he did it for Edwin Meese, and Edwin Meese was Reagan's attorney general. They were best friends. And as a matter of fact, during the hearings to kind of swear in attorney general Meese, they were like, you spent all this money investing in this guy and his companies. Like, what's going on there? And Meese is like, oh, I think his venture capital companies are great and all the rest. Well, it turns out that a lot of the, basically there's a lot of sweetheart deals once Meese gets in there, and that really props up his friends. So this guy, Bryan, if he's involved with the October surprise and all the various things around these deep state operations, by the time we get him into the heart of Promise and his company's trying to get that software, then we know the sophistication behind the idea of how they got targeted, because we're looking at a guy like him who's very deep in that deep state system. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program, going deep on the players here. And we're running over a little bit with time because we're supposed to get your questions in, Miss Olivia. I appreciate it. And how are we doing out there?
Doing great.
Yeah. What kind of questions?
You want a question?
Sure.
It's questions but all over the place. Karen Carpenter wants to know, who do you think the military man was who put the medal on Casolaro's coffin, and what was the medal for?
Well, this is very interesting. So there's an officer this incredibly well decorated officer who shows up at the funeral of Danny Casolaro, and everyone thinks, oh, someone else knows who that is. And this guy's incredibly decorated. He's African American, and
he looks like Colin Powell.
Yeah, the way the description is very much like Colin Powell, although I doubt Colin would be seen in public doing that. But this guy comes up and places a medal on the coffin of Casolaro and salutes him, stands there, and then takes off with another guy who's kind of like a Men in Black type personality, government officer, obviously, and they take off together. And then later the family goes, so who was that, by the way? And, oh, I thought you knew, and it's one of those strange mysteries. But obviously someone deep inside that system knew what Casolaro was working on and knew that he gave his life for it and gave him that salute. And in some way, the research that we're doing now in looking back at Casolaro's work is giving him that salute to how deep he got with it. And he moved the conversation so dramatically. And I think that sometimes, he'd broken so much ground there, but in the kind of washout of the whole thing, he gets connected with certain types of investigations, and they don't go far enough. When you read the Casolaro books, the things about him, the only one that touches the innovative work he was doing is Keith's book about the octopus that Ken Thomas later edited when Keith died. That's the only one that really starts to get there. The other piece, which is crucial, is Dr. Farrell's work on 9/11 in the book that he had there about hidden systems of finance. I have the book, actually. There's a lot in here that I think is crucial, and it is hidden finance, rogue networks, and secret sorcery, the fascist international 9/11, the penetrated operations. And so in here, we have to say that Dr. Farrell already has the outline for this idea. And the outline is very much that there are pieces that are involved with a separate player operating at the deepest level of government. And one of the examples I think that he pulls out of there, which is so fascinating, is that at a certain point, President Bush, instead of flying back to DC, goes and makes a different stop. And the idea is that he's taking over control again of the nuclear arsenal, because somehow their whole thing, while they're doing 9/11, there's another operation that's come in and penetrated their 9/11 operation. And that's where you see that other player crisscross. And there's all kinds of confusion in relation to this. I've pointed out before with 9/11, just to give it a little context, that, there's a couple of things about it that will always be problematic, regardless of how many answers they are. One is the FBI agent walking down the street and the passport comes flying out of nowhere and lands in front of him on a pile of rubble, and it's the passport for one of the terrorists, and he's like, aha, now we know who's behind this. And he gives that to the other FBI agent, and they're like, hey, you know what, he's connected with 19 other guys and we know who they all are. That kind of absurdity. And it's interesting too, because Peter Dale Scott mentioned to me that 4 of those 19 supposed hijackers, would show up and contact the American authorities, and some of them were in Spain and other places, and said, hey, that's not me. Do you have someone using my name? Because I'm still alive. I'm over here. I don't know what that is. And so that's the first piece on that. And Professor Scott calls them designated culprits. And what he says about designated culprits, you can see it as a pattern. The same thing with Oswald, is that those people, just before their deep event is coming up, they get taken off all of these emergency roles and roles that, potential assassins and things like that. And we know that shortly before the Kennedy assassination, Oswald was taken off the Secret Service watch list by the Central Intelligence Agency. And, the idea of doing that when he's going to be in a building with the president's going by, it would be absurd. So obviously they've already decided Oswald's the designated patsy. Well, in the case of the hijackers, you got 19 of them. and guys like Muhammad Atta and all that, they need also that ability to run. So you have to, that's why later they're like, oh, we had an intelligence failure and this intelligence network didn't talk to the FBI and we'll do a better job next time. Just let us get away with this one. And so it's that kind of absurdity. But this is something that Farrell's book gets at, and I think it plays into all of the things that we've been doing around Casolaro here in the last week or two, which, let's just go back to that central idea, which is if somebody placed a backdoor into that software before the Justice Department exploited it and did their own, it means someone was watching the operations that the Justice Department was doing all around the world, the American government invading our allies like Canada and Australia and observing their actions with surveillance, and then luring in these other countries which were not friendly to us to steal the software so we could watch their operations. Well, if this is true, if someone else had a backdoor in it before it went out to all these different agencies, then we're looking at a different player, an extra player right in the middle of it, an unseen player in geopolitical activities, which really, when you look at how the governments work now and how they don't make sense and how the activities that they're engaged in become almost crazy, then you start to wonder, are they being blackmailed en masse? And that becomes, I think, a crucial area for us to look at. So think about it this way. There's somebody up there who has the ability to conduct blackmail operations on all sides. So Russia, you're in the tank. China, you're in the tank. US, you're in the tank. Something else is involved. That's the point of view that opens this conversation up. Then I think you run into the UFO file at the heart of the PROMIS case, because Casolaro's looking for the UFO file. His chief source is saying, look, Casolaro got caught in a shooting war between two UFO intelligence factions. Was that X protect and X share? These things, I think, are opening up because our own perspective of what's happening, and also the shift in the times. The government is trying to conduct a gigantic UFO threat operation. They haven't done that before. They're playing around openly with continuity of government language and emergency powers and things. We haven't seen that before. Even in Reagan's 80s, when the nuclear threat did actually run high, the Cold War threat was there. They had plans behind the scenes, Rex 84, and, rounding up civilians if there was a anti-war movement. This is part of what they made as the new continuity of government program through Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. It was there for any contingency. It wasn't just there for a nuclear contingency. This is the crucial change, and it's the hidden aspect of that system that we're still chasing right now as we speak here in the fall of 2022. So I think that becomes crucial. And the presence of Liz Cheney on the world stage, going after who? Trump. Who did they just raid? They raided Trump. What does Trump have that they would want to raid him for? Why is Liz Cheney involved? These are questions which, are going to take us into that level, regardless of what side of the political stripe you're on. It doesn't matter, because again, Cheney and Trump are both Republicans. So what is it that's going on? That's the key to look at this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep jump off tonight and deep into that aspect of the Casolaro Riconosciuto PROMIS UFO file mystery. Going to be taking your questions here shortly. Miss Olivia's been very patient on this. I really appreciate it. I'm going to do one last section here, and then we're going to jump into your questions. And this part is just more supplementary information regarding Riconosciuto and Casolaro and alternate players and the UFO file. Oh, you know what? I have a Maxwell section here.
Can't skip over that.
All right. Here's the deal. So coming up from earlier, that's in Casolaro's notes, and it is directly, I haven't seen this before. It is directly the Robert Maxwell contact information, and it lists his son also. So he was contacting Maxwell in relation to this. And also there we see Summa Corporation, which is the kind of Mormon takeover of the Howard Hughes corporate holdings. He's got them there, and then he has Wackenhut. So Maxwell, Howard Hughes, and Wackenhut, what do they have in common? Wackenhut handles security for Area 51. Hughes is deeply involved in secret aerospace. And Maxwell, what about Maxwell? Well, let's get into that. I've pointed out with Maxwell and Ghislaine Maxwell and her incredible expeditions there into the Hot Zone, and how her work with Epstein, in my opinion, based on the research that we've been able to show, including the fact that she used the name Janet Atlantis, that she is part of and worked with top scientists going underwater there in the Hot Zone, that she's part of this Hot Zone political piece, and that at the core of that is some kind of cult of Belial, which is the warring factions in Atlantis and the incredible technology and the beings that they were supposed to interact with. So that whole piece, I think, is a crucial idea for understanding what Ghislaine is involved with in Robert Maxwell. We won't find that with traditional deep state or hyper political analysis. I think all the things that we find out about them, looking at them in a clear political way, are useful. And I like all the researchers that do that. But I think if you leave, in the case of the Casolaro case, if you leave out the UFO file, or in the case of Maxwell, if you leave out the Hot Zone piece, that you're missing a big motivational factor that's going to explain the rest. Because there's some piece there involved with these people, especially when you see the presence of top scientists working with them, and also their efforts to blackmail scientists, which I've done a couple of shows on Ghislaine and how they did that with Marvin Minsky, and Marvin Minsky's close relationship with the daughter of Colonel Sanders. And this is a very important crossover, because the daughter of Colonel Sanders was very involved in Atlantis research based on the Edgar Cayce readings and with the ARE, and was going deep based on the instructions of the Cayce readings. So we need to understand that, and we need to also understand the fact that the crossover there is that Ghislaine Maxwell was attempting to get blackmail information, not on some high-level lofty figure only, but she was also looking to get blackmail control file style information on someone named Alexandra Cousteau. And how do we know that? Well, Virginia Giuffre, when she was doing her deposition, giving that information about Prince Andrew, she put it right in there. One of the people they targeted. Well, she went through the different people, but Marvin Minsky, that was a huge one for us to understand. The man who invented AI practically, right over here at MIT. But what about this other person, the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau? Why would they bribe and pretend to attempt to blackmail Alexandra Cousteau and give her all these niceties and include her on all these things? She's the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau, and her dad died tragically in a plane crash, and he was Cousteau's heir. But Jacques Cousteau, he made his lifelong work searching for Atlantis underwater. Now, one of the things that I found out in the middle of all this, and you bet there'll be a Hot Zone piece about this, is that, Jacques Cousteau was also in the middle of Casolaro's wide-angle lens, because Casolaro was looking at Cousteau and saying that Cousteau was under intense scrutiny by intelligence agencies for his underwater work. Now, there's a lot of things that happen underwater, including drug trade, human smuggling, and a number of different things. But one of the crucial things that is not on the board very often, it was put on the board by an intelligence officer named Egerton Sykes, who was a real Atlantis aficionado and actually became the editor of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which is the classic work in the field that goes all the way back to the 1870s. And Egerton Sykes said it's a well-known secret that all of these countries, Russia, China, and all the rest, are seeing the large-scale ruins underwater relating to an ancient advanced culture, and that they all are positioning themselves in relation to that. We've done a lot with the work of Polina Zalitsky and how she found the Cuban city off the coast of the western tip of Cuba, where, by the way, Thomas Townsend Brown used to spend all this time. So what he said was that down there were governments that knew there were things like the Temple of Isis in the Bahamas underwater. Well, part of what we found out, just to refresh it for people who don't know what the hot zone is, I found in talking with people who were engaged in things like mapping the ocean floor and things like that through correspondence, and some of it very unusual, that there were people who needed to sign NDAs and things in relation to that area. And the area was between Bimini, the coast of Florida, the Yucatan Peninsula, and the western tip of Cuba. So that's the hot zone area. It's the same area that Edgar Cayce had predicted there were going to be ruins rising. So it places their activities there, Epstein Island and all these different things, in a slightly different context beyond just their political blackmail activities. After all, political blackmail is limited if you are just looking for something scientific, because they, after all, were recruiting all these scientists. And of course, the pictures of them with Stephen Hawking going underwater in a submarine called Atlantis still ring and reverberate with no explanation. But Alexandre Cousteau is particularly interesting. And then that link opening up in the middle of Casolaro's work, where he says, you know, they've been doing a lot of intelligence surveillance on Jacques Cousteau because of all of his underwater activity. Well, what is going on with that piece? This is the hidden layer, in my opinion, that will open things up for us. So the hot zone aspect, when you get to Ghislaine Maxwell and when she was on the run using Janet Atlantis, and when she, you know, when Scott Bergeron, who became her husband, when he was dealing with his company, which was all about cargo metrics and how to predict when certain shipments were going to land in different places. And he starts talking all about the Arctic and all the things that we need to do to open things up in the Arctic. And he said, just imagine if Atlantis rose with all of its treasures intact. So we're in weird territory when we get around Epstein-Maxwell thing, because I think people understand aspects of it. And I think on the alternative side, they've done a pretty good job with those aspects. But the Atlantis thing is not very well. The hot zone piece and how explosive it is around those characters does not come forward. And I'm trying through this to do it. When I found that in the middle of Casolaro's research, it was like another very alarming piece. This is a shot of Maxwell 3 days before he died. And that's the yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, that he's going to be found off of nude in the water. Just a little while, a few weeks after he's dead, they found out that Pergamon Press was extorting and defrauding all of its investors. And many of the family were really put under some intense scrutiny as a result of that. They escaped ultimately, and Pergamon Press was able to mutate into a few different things. One of the things that gets pointed out, there's a few researchers that have done this. Everyone from Professor Scott to Whitney Webb has been on this. I think Whitney Webb is very interesting on Maxwell. I wanted to show this Robert Maxwell, Pergamon International. This is early on when they're starting to wonder, what is Maxwell doing? And they get warnings from Sandia Labs. And Sandia is really like, it's like Wright-Patterson. It's UFO Central. But the fact that these warnings are going up about Maxwell in 1983 from Sandia, and the NSA is dealing with them and being like, what's going on? And they're saying, this guy is transmitting the databases that he's hacking into, basically. This is in the early 80s. So for him to be right in the heart of it, one of the interesting things I found about Pergamon is they published a number of books about the seafloor throughout the Atlantic. And that some of the books had lofty titles like, Atlantis Reimagined or things of this nature. That's just kind of a side curiosity, but let's face it, it's kind of interesting. All right. Now, the sisters of Ghislaine, a quick section here. Christine and Isabel later became directly involved with technology-based business ventures that directly involved Ghislaine during the very period she worked with Epstein on behalf of Israeli and U.S. intelligence to ensnare powerful U.S. political and public figures in a sexual blackmail scheme involving minors. At the time, Ghislaine described her profession to a number of newspapers as an internet operator. Then after this venture's multi-million-dollar sale to a competitor, Christine and Isabel became involved with successors to the PROMIS software scandals that were closely tied to U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence, respectively. They developed early versions of the kind of, search engine listing software. And the first version was called Magellan. In fact, they did end up selling that. Ghislaine herself became involved in these affairs, as did Jeffrey Epstein following the first arrest. They began courting the biggest names in the U.S. tech scene, from Silicon Valley's most powerful venture capital firms to its most well-known titans. This also dovetailed with Epstein's investments in Israeli intelligence-linked tech firms and his claims of having troves of blackmail on tech company CEOs during the same period. Now, this goes on, and I have an episode that I'm working on in relationship to this, but suffice to say, Pergamon becomes the early Trojan horse aspect around PROMIS. So when we see Epstein and we see Maxwell on the world stage, and, with the Clintons, and I have pictures of Maxwell. Let's see if I have this one. Since, we know Queen Elizabeth passed away recently, there's a shot of Maxwell with Ghislaine, with Queen Elizabeth. This guy wined and dined with the top, and he was saluted in Israel and had his funeral in Israel. And interestingly enough, the highest level former prime ministers and other people came there and, went to his funeral knowing that they needed to be there. And he was definitely bumped off, but like the Casolaro story, they wanted to say, oh, he just, he took a trip on the board and apparently he was depressed and jumped overboard, so it didn't happen. You're not going to jump overboard nude. Anyway, I mean, something's going on there. So this is interesting. And I'll just do this last piece on this. So according to FBI files obtained by Inslaw through FOIA requests in the 1990s, San Francisco's FBI office opened an investigation into information on demand in October 1983 and subsequently reviewed Rouge, R-U-G-G-E, about the business and its activities. She told the FBI that the company's sources included over 250 computer databases, and that the company uses these to locate single facts as well as to provide answers to complex questions dealing with such areas as data summaries, sophisticated literature searching, current awareness services, global information capability. One of these databases included Lockheed's Dialogue Database, the Defense Technical Center, which is connected to the Department of Defense, which contains classified information. She asserted, however, that the company had no password for access and further no need for access. Elsewhere in the document, it notes that information on demand claimed to not have any classified information to the best of their knowledge, and that it includes information concerning government and various available means of tapping government information database. This is the company that Robert Maxwell purchased information on demand from the founder of this company, Sue Rouge, R-U-G-G-E. She was a former librarian, and the Pergamon group, through Maxwell, purchased these databases from her. And then she got into trouble and he got into trouble. The very year plans were made by Earl Bryan, our friend who was the Navy test pilot who harassed who used his company Hadron to harass the Hamiltons to sell them the software. In that very year, Earl Bryan used to subvert the PROMIS. The offices of this woman's company were just a few doors down from the home of Isabel Maxwell and her first husband, Dale Gerasi, son of the scientist credited with creating the birth control pill. That is,
Wow.
the relationships of these people and the stations that they're at and the information that's going out in relation to these various things. When you go deep around Maxwell and when you're looking around PROMIS, you're getting into the Atlantis piece, the scientific piece, the UFO file, and basically the hacking of our planet. So, it's just undeniable. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, Scott, NYC. Casolaro was in over his head.
Yeah.
It's just like the comment of the night. So sad and so true.
Wow. Yes.
Everyone is voting for this question. Kate Garcia, what was the Egyptian drawing on the Casolaro notes?
We included that. In those notes, there's a fax cover page that he used that had these Egyptian figurines on it. I don't know if that was a custom thing that he did or if it was just a lark, but I think that all the documents that we have in relation to Casolaro, we should look at again, because after all, I found Robert Maxwell's phone number in there, and I've never seen that before. And the fact that he put Maxwell, Wackenhut, and Summa Corporation from Howard Hughes all on the same page maybe gives us an idea of what he was finally collating in the final Octopus there. So I don't know what the Egyptian thing was that he had on there.
We don't have a picture of it?
Oh, no, I included it in that's where I think she's getting it, which is I included it in the Farrell video.
Okay, but you don't have it up here now.
Maybe somewhere. You know how it gets. This is the stage of the night where it's like light a match and run because everything is just all over the place. Everyone, wait, before the question, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. You're going deep now. It's X Series 133. This is Maxwell and Riconosciuto and Casolaro and the PROMIS and the UFO file. Going deep on this. Miss Olivia.
So Susie Lomas says, what about those handwritten notes found in Danny's shoes? What was included in those?
Well, again, they referred to people and companies, and Wackenhut was involved with that. I think this is interesting because the crime scene itself, they allowed, obviously the police who maybe weren't originally in on it became in on it, unfortunately. And so the crime scene is very confusing when the maid goes in and finds the blood trail and then finds him nude in the bathtub, with his wrists cut up 12 times. And anyone in the family knew that he was afraid even of blood tests. So this wasn't a guy who was going to do that. They found the phony suicide note, which, they found those with everyone from David Ferry and others. But I think in relation to the creation of this illusion that he had killed himself, it said, farewell to my son or something like that. So this guy, he's not going to commit suicide and leave his son behind. And he knew that people were after him. And his housekeeper was getting harassing phone calls. So we knew things were getting very tricky for him. One of the things at the crime scene that is important to remember is that there were towels with blood on them and all these different streaks on the floor, which means someone was trying to clean up the blood initially and then decided, I have to throw these in the hamper and get the hell out of here. So that's not something which somebody can do after they've committed suicide. So somebody else is involved in the case. Now, there is a weird story, and I don't have the quote for you tonight, but I'll include it. I might even post it on Twitter. And it was a newspaper editor who dealt with the intelligence community and different individuals who did covert work, who said that after the fact of Casolaro dying, one of the people who were covert operators in this side of the world said that he had been on a mission to Virginia to get a reporter, to get information back about Hughes aircraft from a reporter, and that they had to rough him up a little to get back their property that he had come across, and that it was explosive and it would have taken down the Hughes Corporation. And the editor asked him what happened, and he said, "Oh, we just kind of shook him up and made sure that he knew that he couldn't deal with this." And but they didn't mention anything. They made it sound like they had just given him a warning or something like that. So when he went back over his notes, this editor found out that he had that conversation, and the guy was talking about the same night that Casolaro was killed in the Sheraton in Virginia. So those things I think are interesting, because it seems like, as so many of these operations, somebody could have been there and set this up, and then someone else piggybacked on the back of their operation and used it as an opportunity to get rid of him. In any case, the death was completely suspicious. As we went through it a little bit in the video I did with Dr. Farrell and his cousin Marty, one of the things there was that the body was embalmed without the family's permission, and that they didn't tell the family that they had found the body on Saturday. They didn't tell them until Monday. So the police were making all these moves, and the family asked for an autopsy because the brother who they talked to was a medical doctor. He knew all about it, and the police were like, "Oh, it's not necessary because we know it's a suicide," and he said, "Well, you definitely have to do it. We're going to make sure," the brother said, "We're going to make sure you do it." And he said, "Well, it's going to be hard because we've already embalmed the body." So there's a hiding of the evidence right off the bat with Casolaro. And one of his major contacts, who worked at an NSA listening station in Virginia and was fed him details, had shown up that January also dead at an airport, of all places. And that was one of the contacts that Riconosciuto introduced him to. So, these are the facts on the ground about the story. And so there's many trails there at the scene which show you it was obviously, the cover-up was hardcore. And, what I found out from Marty, which is interesting, is every year there's new FOIA requests about it, and they still can't get any information out of him. Yes.
Susie Lomas, Mike Riconosciuto is still alive? Why?
I happen to think that Riconosciuto is a pivotal character because of Marshall Riconosciuto, and that with Marshall Riconosciuto being close to Crisman, that there's a kind of protection there involved. So it didn't protect him from going to prison, but I think it protected him in the long run. And what happened is he got out of prison in 2017, and he was out free for 6 months, and then got grabbed again for something else. I was trying to find out actually where he was being imprisoned, and I have a couple of different reports, one of them from a newspaper or a reporter in Washington, but I haven't confirmed that where he is or what his status is or how long that sentence is. But he went back to jail after getting out for 6 months for the first time in 20 years. So yeah, it's unbelievable the job that they've done on this guy. But remember, Uncle Fred, Fred Crisman, this is what we have to keep in mind. There's a thread there with all of this. And the thread goes through the Garrison case and comes through Promise and all the rest. And the UFO file looms because Crisman, again, is very involved. Uncle Fred is very involved with Riconosciuto. So that, I think, tells us a lot. Yes.
Daniel Ocean, DJ, one would assume Kissinger got his copy, right? That's who sold whatever off to everyone?
Well, it's interesting. We know Kissinger got a copy of the Nixon time capsule letter. Robert Merritt told us that. I can only imagine a guy like Kissinger right in the heart of planning around things of that nature. Here's the other thing that I am trying to find out, but it's listed in 2 different books. And this is absolutely crucial, but Marshall Riconosciuto was friends with Nixon. So
Actually, I mean, friends?
Yeah, that goes back to the 1950s. So this is Nixon, Congress into the Senate. Somehow Marshall Riconosciuto is friends with him. Marshall Riconosciuto, we're going to find out, is a very key player in a number of things. I could probably dedicate a show just to him, to be honest with you. But let's remember that as we get along here. And also remember that the way Crisman really gets involved with him is, through the advertising agency, but he's being bugged. So who's bugging him? In Crisman's book, Murder of a City, under the name John Gold, he talks all about his relationship with Marshall Riconosciuto, and it is fascinating. Yes.
Joseph Farrell, I think there's definitely a space player in the PROMIS mix.
Space player. That's what it is. That's the term, because they're involved with the UFO file. As a matter of fact, the reaction from Riconosciuto when he hears Casolaro's dead tells us, he's like, oh, it's Aquarius versus MJ12, or he's saying MJ12 is a subdivision of Aquarius, but he's mentioning that 2 different fronts in the UFO camp are trying to give information and influence Casolaro to get that out.
Wait,
and Casolaro gets killed dishing it out. Yes.
I missed this Aquarius piece. Did you bring that up tonight?
Yeah, I did.
Because
actually.
that's water bearer. I mean, are we talking
that's
USOs?
True.
Is that the piece?
Well, that's very interesting. Because when you talk about USOs, this is something that they've suddenly added to all of the official nomenclature around UFOs. So now they say UAP, USO. So they have themselves covered. So when you look at a group like Arrow, which is supposed to be Project Blue Book Redux in 2022, unfortunately, you've got the Director of National Intelligence is in charge of it, and some other very sketchy characters. But of course, she really takes the cake because she was the deputy CIA director to John Brennan, and try to find all these this Avril Haines, she tried to find all this legal wrangling in order to give Brennan cover for droning American citizens abroad. That's a sketchy player. But the weird thing is, last year in November, she came out with a big press conference, freaked out, and she said, this might be aliens attacking our ship. I swear to God, like a director of national intelligence saying that ETs were attacking our ships. And then it turned out that the things that they were looking at was basically the junk that Corbell had put out there about these beach balls attacking Navy ships and stuff. So there's something weird in there. I'm going to tell you something else too, which is that the UAP task force reached out to me. And my impression was that, this group that was operating the UAP task force, it's interesting because later it came out that Travis Taylor was involved, and he's all the paranormal guy. He wrote books that were kind of like Unlocking the Secret and things of this nature. And I think there was something in the heart of the UAP task force that was meant to be like trial balloons on a number of different things. And so they, through Avril Haines, they had her come out and really flip out with this thing. And then later, quietly in a report, they came out and said, well, actually the beach ball thing, it turned out were just drone exercises of our own. And it was like the camera got it at an angle or whatever, and blah, it was nothing. But in the meantime, the marketeers and the circus barkers around the UFO thing got their bit, right? The media got their bit. Oh, we get to talk about UFOs because we don't know anything about it. We're just taking CIA talking points. And so they get the whole threat part going. That gets everyone on the threat thing. And then later they can, let the air out of the balloon and say, well, actually, it wasn't anything, But in the meantime, they've been able to spread the headlines. So they're getting all of that data lock from people, and the data mining on it is, How do people feel about this? We're not getting the reaction we thought we were going to get. We put out a UAP task force report and nobody cared. So they're still figuring out how to do this. But the keys, in my opinion, to the way that they're doing it with groups like Arrow is that exchange between Representative Darren LaHood and the DOD official, because that was saying we want to punish amateur interest groups for investigating UFOs. That's the thing to watch out for. And it reminds me very much of how we started the show with them saying UFO videos may violate national security. So does that mean when you point your phone up, are they worried now because everyone has the technology that we can unlock this thing? And they're like, oh, we have to get rid of that idea that you can take your own UFO video. I mean, you're going to order the wrong UFO book and you're going to get a knock on the door from Ronald Moultrie. Lord, I hope it's before breakfast. Yes, keep going.
David Termina, DJ Adnan Khashoggi, another PROMIS software player who Trump acquired the super yacht Nabila from, was used in James Bond movie Never Say Never Again. The yacht was called Disco Volante, or Flying Saucer.
Oh, right. That is fascinating. Well, Khashoggi is so important. And we understand if we go further, when his nephew goes into that Saudi embassy and is killed, that's also a big thread, but also it's related to Princess Diana and Dodi Fayed. So we have a number of things with Khashoggi, but what we know for sure is he's one of the 8 that Casolaro identified as the octopus, because he said the octopus was actually 8 people. This I found very interesting because I was trying to run down which people they would be, and he identified one of them as Khashoggi.
Wow.
Which I think tells us a lot. But also Khashoggi, Peter Dale Scott's done a lot on Khashoggi. Most of American Deep State has Khashoggi featured in it. I highly recommend it.
And you never got around to doing your episode on Khashoggi.
Oh, well, Khashoggi Inc. is a building episode. It builds and builds. One of the things I will say about my conversation with Peter Dale Scott about Khashoggi, though, it's pretty interesting, is that he reminded me that Gary Hart was involved in the 70s with a JFK assassination group looking into the Houston plan. And that's the whole church committee piece and all that. But then twice he got on a committee studying continuity of government. And even in an editorial during the end of the Trump administration was talking about how Trump knew all about continuity of government and those emergency powers. And by the way, do you know what Trump can do? And this kind of thing. But he didn't call it COG, even though that's the committee he was on. Then Peter Dale Scott told me about a meeting he had with Gary Hart where he said, did you know that, this woman that you were caught in Bimini with that tanked your entire political career was one of Khashoggi's harem? And Gary Hart said no, that he was completely oblivious to the fact, and he just thought he was having this, wild, fulfilling relationship with this woman. Well, interestingly enough, she came out of that Adnan Khashoggi world of money, power, yachts, and arms running and all the rest of it. And I'm sure she was being used dramatically in her own way. And we all know the story of Gary Hart and her, and the fact that they were caught in Bimini, I always thought was significant. But the other thing that Scott told me is that Gary Hart had seen the core of the COG records, and that he didn't want to talk about it because he's under complete classified control. So that's why in his New York Times editorial, when he was talking about all these powers that Trump had, he didn't mention continuity of government, because since he's seen it, he knows the power of the COG thing. He can't talk about it. But Peter Dale Scott was definitely convinced that he knew the scope of the COG powers. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight on the Casolaro Riconosciuto and PROMIS UFO file affair. We're taking your questions now. We're going to take a few more questions and sneak in some goodies here as we head toward the end of the show. It's great to have so many people out there. I saw we have Dr. Farrell out there. It's great to see him. We just did an interview, two-part interview with him and his cousin Marty, who had two chance encounters in 1989 and 1990 with Casolaro, and got to give us those impressions of those brief meetings. And I think a couple of interesting things came out of that. One of them, as I pointed out, is that Casolaro, according to Marty, seemed bewildered by the overreaction by the Justice Department, which is kind of telling. And the other thing is the Barry Kumnick piece that Farrell brought forward, and the religious novel, which I think now we have discovered what it is. I'm going to confirm that with Dr. Farrell, and then we'll release that information about what it is. But very interesting indeed. Highly recommend those two episodes. Yes, Ms.
David
Olivia.
Tormina, DJ, wasn't Wackenhut incorporated in Delaware?
That's a real good question. Well, all the problem around Wackenhut and in relation to Promise took place on the Cabazon Indian land, and they were using tribal lands to do demonstrations of these lasers, and the really powerful lasers. And I think what they were doing with this, in my opinion, was there's protocols in place for them testing these types of weapons, which were secret weapons, and they didn't want to go through the protocols and reveal that they had the weapons, the group inside the Reagan camp. So somehow this led to the strange deaths around the Cabazon, that whole piece of the Octopus stories. And there's a wide range of news reports about what took place there, and all the people that were bumped off, and the crooked DA and all this kind of stuff going on with that. And that's on the outskirts of this story, but certainly Wackenhut, with their deep connection with Area 51, which has to be technically the most secret site. I'm sure the Area 51 as Area 51 doesn't exist anymore, but just speaking of it as a street legend, for Wackenhut to have the security contract for Area 51 shows, if you're protecting the UFO file, watch out, right? The other thing that Riconosciuto said, by the way, and I will come up with the quote for this, is that there was a crash saucer in Washington, and that basically the government had cordoned off the area but didn't know how to extract the craft, and that he was aware of where it was in its locale. So now we have Riconosciuto talking about alien autopsies, and then we have him talking about MJ-12 and Aquarius, and then we have him talking about a crash saucer, which the government was having trouble extracting in the state of Washington. And it's very interesting because Riconosciuto, at the same time, we know, has the Crisman background. So when he talks about UFOs, I actually listen. And that's really interesting. So yeah, but the Delaware part, that is, yeah, that's true. Quite fascinating. Go for it.
Joseph wants to know, where did Casolaro say this octopus was 8 people and that Adnan Khashoggi was one of them?
I actually I have that. It comes from an article that Jim Keith wrote, so I can get that to you. I may have it actually here, but I found the fact that it's in the notes. So when he's talking about Khashoggi, now there's a series of notes that are left behind that they constructed. Jim Keith was able to construct the Octopus book with, and in those notes is that reference. But it's for sure that he said it, and also that he mentioned there were 8 people who were involved in the Octopus. I may have that in the intro for the Octopus that's here. I had a couple of quotes from this, so that gives me an opportunity. But yeah, that's really an excellent question. Let's see. This is the opening that Casolaro had for his own book, Behold a Pale Horse, before it became the Octopus. And then we all know, that this is not Cooper's book, which came out a few years later and borrowed the title, which I find interesting also because, Cooper talked about UFOs. Let's not forget. Behold a Pale Horse. This is Casolaro introducing his own book. Behold a Pale Horse will be a haunting odyssey that depicts a manifesto of deceit, decisions of conscience, good and evil, intrigue, and betrayal. John Philip Nichols found his promised land just north of Mexicali on the wild grasses above the Salton Sea. He was 66 years old then, and the Cabazon Indian Reservation on the edge of Sonora was an ideal place for him to nurse his secret self. This was a vast desert emptiness where the yucca marches neatly 40 feet high, where the Mormons saw it as a symbol pointing to the promised land, and they called it the Joshua Tree. But the Joshua Tree is an ugly, unsymmetrical lily with burly arms crooked at the elbow, and it points everywhere, not unlike John Philip Nichols, as if asking itself, what shall I do next? There's a point on the ridge of Little San Bernardino Mountains, known as Salton View, where you see more than 5,000 feet above the desert, and where to the north you can see the great encampment of the Mount St. Jacinto to the south, a man-made Salton Sea, the orchids of the Coachella Valley, and on a clear day, Old Mexico. And he goes on this very interesting description to describe kind of like in the middle of all this beauty. And it's interesting that Coachella is mentioned in there because, of course, Coachella is the big music festival that they do now. But right in the heart of there, he's talking about this kind of seedy underbelly that is right under all this kind of beautiful landscape. So this gives us an idea of kind of the poet in Casolaro as well. Now there's a thing here about the tape, and I have a whole note here on Danger Man, which I didn't get to, and I apologize. So Danger Man's not going to be in tonight.
You mean like with Patrick McGowan? Danger Man?
Oh, no, that's interesting. No, that's a TV series, but no, this is actually a piece of, he called the Riconosciuto Danger Man. Ah. And so there's a Justice Department official that threatens everybody. And there's a whole chapter in here called Danger Man. But anyway, let me see if I could just round this out. What happens is Riconosciuto, as he's giving this information to Casolaro, is keeping all this, a tape, an insurance policy, basically, to make sure that he's kept safe. And interestingly enough, he goes, when all this is taking place and they're threatening him with putting him in jail, he goes and takes the tape, supposedly, and throws it into the same waters where the Maury Island UFO case happened. And then Casolaro spends a time writing in this Octopus presentation about how he spent all this time going through those waters with a team trying to find the tape that Casolaro had thrown into the water. And the tape supposedly was kind of the holy grail of the work that they were doing. So there's something very strange about that and how it relates kind of back to Maury Island again, because we're looking at the same body of water, but this time, instead of the slag from a craft, we're looking for a tape from Riconosciuto throwing it into the water there. There's some of that, there's a weaving mystery, I think, in the middle of that. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Najat Madri, does Casolaro have any relatives / connections who are still alive and know something about what he was doing?
Oh, yeah. His family is very interesting, actually, and his brother originally objected to the way that they handled the case, but unfortunately, they haven't driven the point home over time. They sort of, it seems to me, and unless someone has other information, it seems to me that, the time came and went, and that they lodged their protests at the time and left it at that. Whether they continued to look for things in the background is interesting, but certainly his son, Casolaro was married to Miss Virginia. I don't know if you know.
Wow.
That. And he had a very interesting life. Like I said, he when he was working around the Watergate thing, he was putting it together. And he also said that the Octopus couldn't control Nixon anymore, which is why they got rid of him. So he had a lot of notes. He understood the deep state aspect kind of early on. But one of the things that he did was he got in contact with E. Howard Hunt, and with, you know, because he was freelance writing, and Hunt decided, well, this is a guy I can talk to about this. This is before Hunt went to prison. And they developed a phone relationship, which I think is pretty unusual. I mean, and it's not brought up in relation to Casolaro that he talked extensively with E. Howard Hunt, you know, after Watergate. So he was a dynamic character. He bought and created a series of computer industry publications. That's how he spent the 80s. And it is toward the end of the 80s that he starts hearing about this weird case involving stolen software. And the person who is giving him that information is someone who's associated with Lyndon LaRouche's campaign. And I'll tell you, there's another space connection there, because LaRouche always claimed that he was one of the people giving scientific information to Reagan in relation to SDI Star Wars, and that he realized Reagan was surrounded by all the wrong people and all the rest. Now, the LaRouche group, you know, they have a lot of different factions or whatever. A couple of things that they're good on is they understand aspects of the JFK assassination real well, and they understand how secret government works. Actually, if you could just transplant that information into a UFO investigator, the whole field would get rid of the CIA in a minute. So I have, you know, but I don't buy into all the LaRouche things. But I do think it's interesting that the person who turned Casolaro while he was working at a computer magazine, having given up his independent reporting career, he's working around tech, and it's this Jeff Steinberg from the LaRouche group comes to him and says, there's this case you might be interested in. And then Casolaro sells. Well, it's a destiny. Yeah. It's a destiny. But Casolaro takes the information, is so blown away by what he finds out that he sells the magazines. And they say that he sold them at, like, you know, an incredible discount, and that they were worth so much more. So he had developed 10 years of this computer side, and he hears about this case. So that's what gets him into that. And then it's Riconosciuto that opens things up on there. And it's interesting because Riconosciuto is introduced to Casolaro through Jeff Steinberg as well. So Steinberg really opened things up there. What else am I missing on this? Oh, I wanted to mention something before I forget about Earl Bryan, who, do you remember the test pilot who, you know, was chasing after the incredible heiress, and he was the guy.
Man of the year.
Yeah, man of the year with Biden, the Hadron guy. Not only was he in the CIA Phoenix program, but what they said about him in the Reagan administration is he was in charge of the nation's behavior modification and mind control experiments. That's in his official bio. Wow. Now check this out. Of course, he's involved in the buyout of Inslaw. That's what he was trying to attempt to do. But before he gets into trouble, Hadron keeps building up as this company. And when he gets out of prison, he participates in selling Hadron off and creating a new company called Xonics, with an X, X0, Xonics, and it's radar and communication. Again, and that company is going on for years. I think it's still going on, as a matter of fact. But Xonics is, you know, the final output there for Earl Bryan. I found that particularly interesting. Yes, Miss Olivia.
So one of the things is it the Cabazon Indians in
Yes.
Indio? Right. So they were experimenting with bioweapons.
Yes.
Karen Carpenter wants to know, is there, I'm going to go for it, is there tech in the jabs to give access to our biometrics, etc., via a PROMIS type program?
It's really interesting. I found something exactly like what you're talking about in the heart of this. and I'm not sure if I don't get to it, I will come back to it. But there is something in there that is involved. Actually, I know for a fact that I have it with this, but why don't we keep rolling, Miss Olivia?
I think this is we have to admit that this is the goal, and it's been stated that.
Oh, here it is. I found it. Thank you. All right. This relates directly to what you're talking about. The race weapon. Riconosciuto would make additional claims about Biorad Corporation, a medical supplier which had gradually taken over Hercules, California. They were also, Riconosciuto would say, covertly engaged in biowarfare research, producing some of the deadliest toxins known to man. The focus of Biorad's research was said to be bioactive elements that could be tailored to attack those with certain types of DNA. Weapons would thus be produced that were specifically designed to wipe out specific races or genetic classes of human beings. Alternatively, particular DNA types could be immunized against a deadly biological agent. The agent could then be released and everyone else would die. This is the setup for this corporation. Whether they achieved this is something different, but Riconosciuto is saying this is the target, that they have a DNA weapon. That's directly from Riconosciuto's own comments, for what it's worth. I think it answers some of the things you mentioned. Very interesting. Yes.
Ogan 5, has Daniel ever taken an extended look at how ridiculously much Chris Carter has suddenly has an immense amount of accurate fodder for the X-Files, Millennium, and the Lone Gunman?
Yes.
It is shocking the amount of information. The disclosure was really going on there. Yeah. Where did he get it?
Well, let's not forget that he showed up for the Secret Space Conference. And I think he listened to Dr. Farrell's lecture, if I'm not mistaken. But he's obviously somebody who knew a great deal. And, you know, when you watch that show and the way that it's played out, it's quite interesting because in some sense, the outcome of the X-Files, in my opinion, is that there are no aliens. But at the same time, you know, there's the official thing in the show that they're colonizing, right? But over and over again, there's this reference to the idea that they're operating with something else. So, but not just in relation to alien stuff, but just in terms of UFO secrecy, the X-Files is obviously so ahead of its time. And what's interesting is, you know, it's X-steganography. Everyone knows the X-Files, right? But it is pretty hardcore X-steganography if you really think about it. And of course, Scully, and the first big UFO author is Frank Scully, as we know. So there's a lot of deep references, hardcore, in there. But really good question, and I concur. How unusual. Okay, I started the program off tonight with DARPA. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So remember now that our friend there, the CIA 25 years in the directorate, Jim Semivan, who launched this whole UFO thread, and you know, Luis Elizondo and all that stuff. Well, he said that his case about he and his wife and their contactee experience, that DARPA was checking it out. That's how we started the show. And the guy who was doing the blog is like, wait a minute, does this mean DARPA is doing UFO research? Isn't that new? What's going on with that? And it is strange. But listen to this. According to Riconosciuto, the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, was in charge of classified contracts for biological warfare research. Riconosciuto would later testify under oath that Stormont Laboratories was involved in the DARPA Wackenhut Cabazon project. DARPA's involved all the way back there. Jonathan Lippman, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, would relate Cabazons and Wackenhut appeared to be acting as middlemen between the Pentagon's DARPA and Stormont Laboratories, a small facility in Woodland near Sacramento. And the idea is they were trying to sell biowarfare products to the Army through Wackenhut. You know, this runs deep. You have a UFO threat operation where all the people seem to have advanced medical degrees. including this Gary Nolan guy who's saluting Dr. Fauci. And he's like, I'm an immunologist too, but I'm also a contactee who's part of the CIA. I'm going to bring you to Jesus. Now, over and over again, even with people as low level as Elizondo, he has patents on diseases and things, and he has all this medical background. What is going on when you get into that position of being involved in the UFO ops that you somehow need to have a medical background? And I find that interesting. And I also think not only does it lend itself to mind control aspects when you think of psychological warfare training, but it also lends itself to that kind of experimentation about biowarfare. And so when they get that around the UFO thing, it rings a real big alarm bell for me, who's been studying it for a while. So that's why I think the CIA threat people, I would think that the field needs to draw a real hard red line about dealing with them, and the sooner the better. And so that way it can be that the people, like the Megyn Kellys and the Tucker Carlsons of the world, don't just take these people at face value. Do any of these people, are they associated at all with secret labs projects? Does that need to be investigated? After what took place in the Wuhan lab, shouldn't we all be looking at all these people a little bit differently? I think so. And I think that it should be more of a screening type process around the UFO thing, not to, accuse people, but, it should be a screening. If you're involved in this field, looking into the UFO file bit, then if you're in intelligence and you have a medical connection, then it would seem to instantly say that you have an agenda that's related to what they want to do with the threat narrative. So there has to be a screening on the side of people who are in the field and say, well, if somebody's involved with that, I'm not dealing with it. And I'm not, I think that that's going to be crucial, especially money behind it. And Marco Rubio is at the head of it, swinging a towel, getting ready. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew. I'm going to read again the Riconosciuto explanation for Casolaro, what he described after Casolaro's death, because I think it's important to round out this episode. We'll take 2 more of your questions, and then we're going to round it out, Miss Olivia. Outstanding, and thank you for being patient with all my comments, because there was a lot to get to tonight on this, and I'm thinking a lot since the Farrell and Marty Farrell interview. Okay. After Casolaro's death, Michael Riconosciuto made claims that Casolaro had learned nothing more than what one of 2 intelligence factions wanted him to know in order to embarrass the other faction. One faction was called Aquarius and had a leadership subgroup called MJ-12, the name, of course, of the supposed secret group founded by Harry Truman in the wake of the Roswell flying saucer crash. Riconosciuto even told one writer they had witnessed the autopsy of an alien body, as we mentioned. This long before the famous alien autopsy film. Some have suggested that the tales of extraterrestrials that surround Area 51 and Pine Gap serve as disinformation to deflect attention away from serious issues. However, when you think about it, Casolaro is saying, well, he was getting UFO disinformation from 2 different sides. But why was it that the UFO groups were targeting Casolaro? Why, if Riconosciuto is correct, and after all, Uncle Fred would give us some idea that Riconosciuto knows what he's talking about in relation to the UFO file, why would they be interested in giving him this information? What was it that they were giving him? Well, Casolaro was deeply engaged in research around the Hughes Corporation, Area 51 before it was popularized. Hughes, Area 51, and MJ-12. They're all included in his notes. So Riconosciuto is basically saying he's targeted by UFO intelligence groups that want to get a certain message out. That's the thing that they think he's going to explode in the world. As a matter of fact, we might be looking at a situation which is a precursor directly to the Bob Lazar revelations, because his work around UFOs in Area 51 was previous to Lazar's revelations. So we're looking at somebody who already was tied in with that. That's where I think the next phase of that research needs to go. Absolutely. Miss Olivia.
I have to get this one in. King, give me a break. King Snurgle Gurgleson. The
I
Viking.
just say King
Sorry,
SG.
I didn't get it all. The Viking.
The Viking.
Imagine two Spectre-type organizations at war against each other. Then look at the plan unfolding around you. What do you see?
Yes. You could be dealing with multiple groups. I would agree with that. I think the idea of an unseen actor in the middle of all these geopolitical players makes a lot of sense. It seems to me there's one prominent actor involved. But I think that we can start to see now that something else may be operational. And it comes through with the Casolaro research, and it comes through with the crisscross of the software AI control, which after all, Barry Cumnick works on what? Brainstorm. What does that do? That's really, the description is so hardcore AI. And I found out a few things about Cumnick. For sure, he's a real person. Sometimes he's listed in public as Cumsick, Kumsick, not Cumnick, Kumnick. He's a computer engineer. He did Intel work for Northrop Grumman. His father was involved with Randy Weaver at Ruby Ridge and was involved with those groups. And his name was Frank. And he's in a PBS special, Frank Cumnick. Brainstorm is kind of one of the earliest AI versions of software created. It is the extrapolation of PROMIS. Yes, he went underground and disappeared. He went off the grid basically for some 20 years. And in that time, as we found out from Dr. Farrell, he was in this fundamentalist Christian novel, and they were portraying him as the person who put the backdoor into PROMIS before it was stolen. Well, we know he worked on it after, for sure. So there's a lot of interesting things there about Cumnick. Supposedly, in 2013, he presented some information on the web, and I've seen that information. I'm trying to confirm it, but it shows kind of relational software, and it reminds me very much of the setup of groups like Palantir. So I wonder if they didn't adopt his research. One of the interesting things that's stated in relation to Cumnick is that he had been offered $25 million for his software, that he was going to accept it, Brainstorm software, and that they reneged, and that as a result of that back and forth, he went underground and didn't let anyone know where he was and hid out, and everyone assumed he was dead. And there's a lot of books that list him as, dead because he disappeared, but no, he resurfaced in 2013, but he doesn't talk about this stuff. Would I like him to come on this show? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
David Tormina, Octopus sounds similar to Hydra from the Marvel universe, which could involve the occultists from the Nazi International.
Yeah, I think there is an occult piece, and if you look at Riconosciuto, you will find that he talks a lot about Satanist groups and how he had a map of where all the Satanist groups were. So there's a weird overhang there with Riconosciuto. He's got this high-tech UFO element, this genius laser engineer, computer engineer. And then in the middle of all that, he's talking about, I've mapped out where all the Satanists are. That's pretty weird. And so that's where my mind went to on that. Yes.
It's exciting. Joseph says, we may have found the novel, waiting for it to arrive in the mail. We're still trying to figure that out, which one it is.
Absolutely. I want to talk to you and confirm on that one, because I think as you have found it, I think I want to crisscross that with you. And I definitely want to confirm that and get that out, because it's just extraordinary. And I will say that Cumnick hangs out there as a real mystery in the middle of all this. Yes.
Confectionery Arts. Huawei from China is promise on steroids. Simone Nyman says, question, given China's implementation of the Great Reset measures like zero COVID lockdown and weather control, do you think China might play the fake alien invasion card to secure absolute control? If that was a trial run for all of this and everything started there first, they could do the same thing, spreading it across the globe from China, starting there.
Well, we saw that COVID started from the China labs. So you may be onto something there. I think that China's moon program has the ability, and that the American X-Protect group doesn't trust that when China discovers something on the moon, or if they haven't already, that they wouldn't reveal it and have some kind of an edge on America. So that there are people who collaborate in the American government with the CCP is obvious, and that's where I think you would get the kind of thing that you're talking about. But otherwise, I think that the big fakers on the scene are the X-Protect American intelligence homeland security groups, the ones who are building the threat operation. I think are planning to present evidence that there's a threat, and I don't trust the evidence at all, especially not with the characters that they've pushed out there, who are pretty mealy-mouthed and are not very consistent in the things that they've said. So yeah, we got a big problem there because that thing's being pushed through the media, and we know how the media is on that. They just take their orders, basically. Quick thing on Casolaro. Let's see. This is interesting, and I was thinking about this in relation to Marty in our conversation that Dr. Farrell and I had with him earlier. Check this out. This comes from Sherry Seymour's book, The Last Circle, on Casolaro, and it's just a brief little thing. And it says, Casolaro was, of course, intent on interviewing Peter Wiedniks, whose name came up in conversation with Marty as one of the names that Casolaro had said during their meeting, and that something to the effect that I don't trust this guy Wiedniks. Wiedniks, I got a picture of him. It's not easy to get, but he was someone who was a Justice Department agent that was basically threatening all parties involved to step back and, especially Riconosciuto, and not support the Inslaw case and all the rest. So with that in mind, listen to this from The Last Circle by Sherry Seymour. Danny Casolaro was, of course, intent on interviewing Peter Wiedniks. A strange coincidence occurred during the week prior to his death. While sitting in a pub having a beer, a man named Joseph Suhler approached him, and they began talking. At some point during the conversation, Danny disclosed the contents of his investigation and expressed a desire to interview Peter Wiedniks. To Danny's astonishment, Suhler, claiming to be a Special Forces operative, said he would arrange a rendezvous between Peter Wiedniks and Casolaro. Suhler's connection to Peter Wiedniks allegedly came from Wiedniks' wife, Barbara, who was the executive assistant to the powerful West Virginia Democratic Senator Robert Byrd. Byrd had played a major role in the effort to have the CIA move some of its administrative offices to Charlestown, 20 minutes from Martinsburg on the Virginia border. It was apparently through Barbara Wiedniks that Suhler intended to arrange the interview. Casolaro confided to friends that he was unnerved by this meeting. This is a chance meeting, exactly like the Marty meeting, but in this case, it's a military intelligence officer who knows Wiedniks. Obviously, they sent this guy in there so that he would have a one-on-one with Wiedniks. Apparently, it never happened, but I mean, hanging out in pubs in Virginia, you're right in the middle of that intelligence community, and they can set those types of things up. But you can see that Marty's story has resonance there because he had these kind of casual, let's have a drink and talk type of thing. And he was doing this with a perfect stranger, and it turned out the guy had a connection to Wiedniks. How unusual is that? And with that, everyone, I'm going to leave you with this. Michael Riconosciuto claimed that he had made his modifications to PROMIS on the tribal lands of the Cabazon Indians in Indio, California, as somebody pointed out correctly earlier. As part of a joint project the tribal administrators had with a private security firm known as Wackenhut. Wackenhut provides security services to the notorious secret airbase Area 51 after Casolaro turned up dead, and this is Jim Keith's book. After Danny Casolaro turned up dead and his current research file missing, other notes found at his apartment later clearly indicated his interest in this Nevada super spook facility. The base, of course, has been around since before it was used to develop the U-2 spy plane in the late 50s and the early 60s, and later the SR-71 Blackbird. This is written, obviously, back in the 90s. It has not yet become the subject. As Casolaro made his notes about it, however, it had not yet become the subject of popular lore that it is today. Nevertheless, Casolaro devoted pages of notes on Area 51. There it is, unmistakable. So Casolaro was on to Area 51, and this is a key factor, I think, in the whole thing. And with that, Miss Olivia, you get the last question.
Okay, it's not a question. I just wanted to wish Tricky Vicky a very
Yes.
happy birthday. She says it is her 61st birthday, and she was born in 1961.
Wow. Unbelievable. Well, happy birthday. And it's great to have you out there. You're always making fantastic comments in the ideas room. The ideas room on fire tonight. Just incredible.
I'm always impressed. You know, I cannot believe there's so many things I jot notes down to follow up on. I never have time to. They're amazing. They're so
Wow.
knowledgeable.
Let's see. Did I leave anything out? Well, I think we covered a lot of it. I will probably have something else coming up.
Are you going to make this into a documentary? What do you think?
Well, I think there's so much. There's probably more things that are going to come forward, and that will. It's going to be an ongoing area of investigation, but it's huge. I think the ramifications are gigantic. So that would probably be a yes on it, Miss Olivia. Miss Olivia, your super chats are up.
Okay. I would like to thank Mindy Drake, Gillen Joy R., Bob Bennett, Debbie McAdoo, Tricky Vicky, C.D. Kaleo, Charles Marlowe, Medley Childress, Jim Sarge 3ID, Erica Swenson Elliott, Shazam, Les Scott, Mr. Wolf, and Gummy Bears. Eurythmia's Fun, Bo Krill, CT, Wilbur Wobbler, Sandy Peters, Doyle Wayne, Jennifer Walters, Occult Fan, Melody Lenz, Karen Carpenter, Wolfgang McCarthy, James Cregan, Bob Bindert, and Robert Mearns. Thank you so much.
Wow, outstanding. Well, your support is so important to us. We really appreciate it. And it's just great having everyone here. And thank you so much. Of course, to all our subscribers everywhere, thank you for your support. We couldn't do what we do without you. And it makes all the difference. We will be back with you. We have some interesting interviews coming up for you next week, and then back the following week with a new X Series episode. And just off the charts, like I said, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. That's where you're going to find all the exciting things that we have coming up. That's a free newsletter, and you'll get it once a week. If you want to go deeper and still get some of those special extra episodes like the one we have right now with Dr. Farrell in the members area, then you can join and become a subscriber for the site. We've made it very affordable, and we'll keep that discount through the rest of the year. Then we have some exciting things coming up for you later this month, so you're going to want to stay tuned. And I'm going to do a couple of shout outs, actually. Oh, I'm going to actually employ my own software. Timothy Guessing to the Arcane. Absolutely. Good night, Team DJ Andy B. Thank you, sir. Good night. It's good to have you here. Norman Smith, Max Lupo, Sandy Peters. Wow. Andy M. Great show. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I know it's a lot of information, and even for me, when I was getting through it, I was starting to see this crisscross pattern. So we're going to do more on it, and I hope we can get Dr. Farrell's input on it for sure as we go further. Chrissy's out there. What a brilliant gentleman you are, Dark Journalist. Unbelievable. Well, flattery will get you everywhere. I appreciate that. I really do. And you're always ask great questions, Chrissy. Thank you. What a great presence you are. My brain is overloaded, says Najat, but there's no other way I want to spend a Friday night. See, that's what I'm talking
Right
about.
on.
That's the ideas room for you. It's like nothing better. Miguel, go DJ. Thank you so much, sir. And thank you. I know you reached out to Yoko Ono. This is an interesting story. If this happens, watch out. This is going to be really wild. Yoko in the hot zone. I'm telling you, live. He's not kidding. Thank you so much. That's wild. That's what Pokey used to say. Thomas Tyson, I know there's a joke in there somewhere, sir. Caritas Tarot. That was one for the record books, DJ. Wow. Yeah, I know. We're going pretty long, too. What are we on here? 3 hours and 20 minutes?
This is the latest we've ever ended.
Unbelievable. Yeah, we started late, too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Scarlet Fire. Nobel Peace Prize Committee said they gave the prize to Obama for no particular reason and wish they hadn't. Well, they should have given him the clerk for the Bankers Award. That would have made sense. Great show. Thank you, everyone. Hey, by the way, good old Joe Biden is going to come here for the JFK Library anniversary and talk about a new moonshot, but not a shot to the moon. It's about a medical thing. Well, we'll see about that, Joe.
Is it medical or is it about climate change?
No. Well, that's a good question. I think it's I think it's supposed to be like a, it's
curing cancer.
Yes,
finally.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thanks, DJ. Thank you, Tel Jacobs. Unbelievable. Sandy Peters, great show. Fantastic. Johan Wolf, dark journalist, deep ocean, vast sea. Wow. Climb up to the highest point. Excellent. Thanks, Miss Olivia, for maintaining chat room decorum. Whew, boy, does that make a difference. Thank you. And
all by my lonesome.
No, wow, right. There's no Gigi, no nobody. It's great, actually. Gigi just did a video on Ahriman and Steiner and Christ and Lucifer. It was just really incredible. I highly recommend that. That one's there. David Termina. This was a hell of a big time episode that you're not going to find anything else quite like it. Great job, DJ Olivia and the ideas room. David Termina, that's pretty good. I highly agree. Whew, that's something else. Fantastic to have you all with us. Of course, Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Jerome Swanson, love you guys. Shout out to DJ and Miss Olivia and the ideas room. Jerome, you're there, sir. Thank you. Thank you for being here, everyone. We will see you next week with some powerful interviews and have a very fantastic weekend. I hope it's an enjoyable one. And we'll all remember the incredible bravery of Danny Casolaro, incredible instincts and writing capability to nail this down, and the courage that he had in the face of extreme odds. And we give him a salute from the heart tonight. And his work was definitely not in vain. So just amazing things that he's left us to follow up on so that we don't go into these things blindly. He's given us some light on that. Oh my goodness, I was listening to the GG lecture today. Highly recommended. Yes. Whew. Unbelievable, Chrissy. Debbie McAdoo. Thanks, DJ. Thank you so much. Thank you, Miss Olivia. Bravo. Round of applause for Miss Olivia. We'll be back with you next week. Outstanding crowd tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us. And, once, never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Good night, everybody. God bless.